and make policies that can give the youth opportunities to have an enabling environment to thrive. So with this, I will pose a solution question to Sige. This is for you. Yeah, no problem, it's all right. What strategies can government, educational institutions, and organizations implement to provide comprehensive education, skill training, and inclusive opportunity that empower youth and individuals as well? So just 3 minutes, then.
Okay, I'll be quick with that. So I think most of the countries have their own education and skilling program in place. So for instance, in Bhutan, there is the normal school and college education system, and then there is TVET. In addition to that, there is nationwide skilling program to provide skilling to the out-of-school unemployed youths. Otherwise, these out-of-school unemployed youths, they get left out. So I think in order to target all the youth, I think that kind of program is important. And from our experience, this has been quite, I would say, productive. But at the same time, I would also like to mention here that often you get criticism saying that you are providing so much trainings, where are the youth employed? But generally, if you look at it from the percentage point of view, I feel that it may be similar in most countries. So the percentages are not high, but at the same time, these programs are needed because these programs ultimately are able to change the lives of quite a number of youths, while the percentages might not come out to be very high. So I feel that these kind of skilling programs are very important. And the other point that I would like to mention here is the importance of building the ecosystem. I think the ecosystem for skilling and the ecosystem for promoting entrepreneurship and innovation is very important. For instance, in Bhutan, we started with a small tech park and the technology incubator within the tech park, and that has really helped. And there are other players as well, both government as well as NGOs in the sector. All these working together, to create a vibrant ecosystem, I think is very important. And last but not the least, I would like to mention here that access to finance is very important for these youths. And in most countries, I think access to finance is a challenge, and it has been the same in Bhutan. Maybe my co-panelists can share their thoughts later on, so I will stop at that. Thank you.
Yes, there is one aspect also, if I may say, in the digital revolution that is being led by the youth, that brings together ASEAN and also Africa, and that is the movement of money. So you hear about M-Pesa, the groundbreaking M-Pesa, right? It was only a matter of years when the first e-money came out in Southeast Asia, specifically the Philippines, as a function of the global diaspora of all the migrant workers from all over the world. 1-2 years after, M-Pesa followed. The point is, we are mobile first. It doesn't have to be your fancy phones. It could be a feature phone. But how many of you in the audience carry at least 2 phones? Raise your hand. Clearly a youthful market. In Asia, for example, in the Philippines, we have a population of 115 million people. Guess how many mobile phone numbers there are? 168. So for 168 million, so for every Filipino born, it actually comes with a mobile line. The thing I'm saying is the mobile digital revolution is being led by the youth, and it's being led by ASEAN. And that is actually what gave rise to fintech. Africa, for me, is one of the hubs. It's ground zero of fintech with M-Pesa. The fastest growing fintech market in the world is ASEAN. I mean, Nigeria is actually leading it. So I think financial inclusion is being led by the youth, not by central bankers coming from Switzerland, but rather in both Africa and also Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll jump on to you. Roskan.
Okay. So few points to this. I think from different points of government, private sector, so on, as we've seen, whenever there's a crisis, the youth is the first to, either lead the way or take a stance, be it the Arab Spring movement, the climate strike, action movement, so on and so forth. I think for public institutions, setting up youth advisory councils, youth sounding boards is one very tangible thing they can do. And you see this around the world. EU is doing it. A lot of progressive governments are doing that. We need more of it. I think second, and I'm trying to focus on, since the topic of this panel is youth-led, youth-powered development. So I'm talking more from a leadership point of view. I think governments and private sector really need to fund more leadership training programs for young people. The younger you train them, the easier it is to groom them, cultivate them, in all ways. And the world that we're living in, we need programs which bridge the best of the West and the East. How can we have programs which allow for cross-pollination of ideas and communities across the world? Now with technology, we can have somebody sitting in a very rural village having a buddy system with someone in the US, right? So the boundaries of having to be in an urban space or having to have access to certain resources is also diluting. So how can we tap on that? I think third, I would say, the role of innovation labs, tinkering labs, accelerators. In India particularly, the past decade, there has been a huge surge, so that's great. But then how do we even focus on hand-holding entrepreneurs when things don't work? As we know, 1 in 10 entrepreneurs only succeed. So how can we help in helping them pivot to other opportunities? So I think those support systems are also very important. So those are some tangible points.
Thank you so much, Vaskant.
Yeah, I wanted to add to your point about how we can support entrepreneurs who are not successful. And that's the big part that Silicon Valley, I think, it's very successful when it comes to entrepreneurship because we celebrate failure. So in our culture, it's like, oh, you had a startup, it didn't work, you can try again. Like, it's actually, we really celebrate that, and it's a little bit cultural. I know that, I'm originally from Iran, and in my country, like, we don't celebrate failure. You're like, oh, you're a loser, like, you couldn't make it happen. But it's very important for the youth to not be scared of trying. And that's a little bit cultural, and accelerator and incubator are a very important part of it to, like, create that culture that, like, hey, if you're not successful, we are here for you, because there is no other place for an entrepreneur to go. They're not in university. They don't have their friends around when they're an entrepreneur. They have to have a space when they are not successful so they can try again, right? And they don't feel like they can't fail, because without failure, there is no way for entrepreneurs to be there. Very important to build that culture.
Just
Thank
one
you.
quick point there. I also want to
30
add
seconds, please.
that in today's day and age, we really need to create programs that are multidisciplinary, rather anti-disciplinary. Those old school ways of thinking of this is my stream or this is my background, like those are just going to break down. So how do we train people to have transferable skills? That is super important.
Just 1 second.
Yeah.
I just want to ask if we have any questions from the audience so we can take questions. Thank you so much. So just please walk up to the mic. Sorry. Okay, back. There's one over there as well. So you just stand by the mic. We'll get to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to pose a question to Sarah. I think.
Sorry, excuse me. Can you speak louder? Thank you so much.
Okay. I want to pose a question to Sarah. You have captured our crisis here in South Africa very well. Currently, we are sitting on 31.9% in terms of unemployment. And majority of those people are young people. Majority of them are from the rural areas. I've heard you said you came to Cape Town, you saw one innovation center, and you are happy about that. But the fact of the matter is that in rural areas, Cape Town is just an urban area. In rural areas, those innovation centers are not there. It's unfortunately. But then the question I want to check with you is that what programs do you have in Silicon Valley to support a rural youth in terms of those hubs and entrepreneurship? Thank you.
Thank you so much. You.
Thank you for your question.
Hold on, Sarah. Sorry.
Thank you, Program Director. Maybe mine is not necessarily a question, but to echo the views based on the deliberations from the panel. I think I'm going to speak on the perspective of South Africans. The issue in my country is not the strategy, neither the issue in my country is not the willingness to actually thrive and revive the economy. By economy, I'm extending to the fact that you deal with the issue of race and gender and etc. But the issue in South Africa is that you can't speak about strategy and policies without mentioning the issue of race. Why do I say this? I think in South Africa, we've got the best policies in the world. I mean, the International Labour Organization have overemphasized that fact. But the issue in South Africa is about how do we go about breaking the barriers. And the barriers that we have in South Africa has to do with race. There is an element of fear among black South Africans. They develop strong policies, but because they're scared of whiteness. They're scared of whiteness. There is no way that in South Africa, the majority of the people who are exempted, in other words, who are not part of the economic mainstream are black in particular, but the dominance is black. And if you go to parliament, the threshold of the representation is actually black. Those are the policy makers. Those are the constitutionalists of this country. And you ask yourself, why then, if you got the best strategies in the world, not implement those strategies? It's the issue of race. They're scared of whiteness. And everybody else is fearing this element in the room. To first, whenever you want to address the social ills of the country, you have to deal with the issue of race in South Africa. Unfortunately, we've got the best policies in the country, but we whether you like it or not, the false dichotomy which we often have in this country is to say policies versus implementation and omitting to exclude the issue of race. Whiteness in this country is feared. And I don't think I must blame black people. It's not their fault. It's something that has been instilled over the years. And it's something that they're scared to get out of. Right? The president that is sitting today is a black person, and we've got total power in terms of implementing those policies. But because we were made to believe that as black people, we can't do it without the presence of whiteness. And I think we at a stage where we have to be honest with one another.
Thank you so much.
So that we are able to address the social ills of this country as coordinated actors acting consciously to address the issues of South Africans without the issues of having to be scared of race.
Thank you so much.
You,
yeah. Sorry, open it.
Thank you, Program Director. The name is Kifenzo Mkari once again from the OR Tambo School of Leadership. I would like to engage the brother on the questions that he raised, but we'll do it outside because I think there are fundamental flaws in some of his arguments that need to be addressed. Nonetheless, I think I appreciate Ama's, thinking out of the box, which essentially says to us, part of the problem with the current political system is that it is afraid of what it can't regulate, right? So every time young people come with these out-of-the-box initiatives, there's some element of fear in the disruption that comes with it. And I mean, Amma was correct, you can even see it in the setup. Why is it when young people are a panel, some people have to go upstairs? Why don't they want to hear some of these ideas? But I think also on the issue asked of how can we ensure massive education of young people, it has been addressed a bit, but I want to rehash that we need to rethink and redesign the systems of learning, teaching and learning. Because currently, the education system, the way it's set up, particularly in the global south, it does not allow for innovative thinking. It's always playing catch up. So we need to really think about what kind of new methods of teaching and learning do we adopt in order to ensure that we can empower young people to come up with more of these innovative ideas. Lastly, I think that young people should be at the center of building global visions, regional visions, as well as national visions. Because if there are some people who are sitting at the UN who can't relate with us and are giving us Agenda 2063, for me, it doesn't make sense. At the center of each vision that we build, it's young people that should be given the opportunity to input so that we can understand, as these visions are adopted, our roles and responsibilities. But to play a devil's advocate in closing, I think we are also at fault because we are not systematically organized and we are not well mobilized. We are as if waiting for these things to come to us. We're waiting for people to create space for us. So in closing, let us go back, organize, mobilize, so that we can sit at the right tables. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Final
There
thoughts.
ain't much time, so 60 seconds per starts now. What do we do together? Talk is cheap. It's important that we decide what we're going to do after this. First and foremost, in digital Pilipinas, we're looking to create a financial digital footprint for gamers and gigsters, so they actually get loans, they get insurance, they get health coverage. Second, we just rolled out our ASEAN Startup and SME Village. Let's get the youth to solve the problems of industry via hackathon and pitch fests. Last but not the least is, and a very important realization for me over the weekend, is that in all our important conversations, we must at least embed someone who is actually from the youth, right? 19 years old is the average age in Africa. Clearly, none of us is 19 years old. And in the case of ASEAN, the average age is 25. So inclusion is not just about poverty porn. It is actually about the underrepresentation of important regions like ASEAN and also of the youth sector. Mabuhay po, maraming salamat.
Sarah.
Yes, I wanted to answer the question about creating innovation centers in places that we don't have access to right now. What I've noticed in my experience is having even a couple of people in the community that encourage the entrepreneurial spirit of like take risk in those places will really affect the whole community. If you have only one or two people who like out there and like really try to take care of entrepreneurs, the new entrepreneurs in those regions, slowly build up the culture and the community. And that's the only way at the beginning until we can really go to those places and have innovation centers and have communities to be able to really help new entrepreneurs.
Thank you so much. Vaskant, do you have any?
So I'd like to end by coming back to the climate and health space. Again, as we know, as young people and people from the global south, though we haven't contributed to the problem, but we'll be the ones facing the brunt of it. Those of you who are interested, we're doing some exciting stuff at COP28. If any of you are there, we're launching a climate and health initiative. This is being led by the Asian Development Bank, but we have other member countries and development institutions. So if any of you are interested in being part of it and knowing more, happy to throw light. We're looking at how to build bankable projects, so on and so forth. And secondly, looking at nature-based solutions and youth for, or rather, generation restoration is another area. So anyone's
so much.
interested,
20
happy
seconds,
to
please.
chat further.
Okay. Firstly, I couldn't mention FDI before, so one of the ways to create opportunities is also to have FDI in the company. For instance, I'm serving as a director of a FDI company from Switzerland in Bhutan. And lastly, I would like to mention that whatever we do, be globally relevant, but be locally rooted. So in Bhutan, for instance, we follow the philosophy of gross national happiness, which is about balancing material pursuit with psychological well-being. Thank you.
Thank you so much. With this, we close the session. And thank everyone for taking out time despite your tight schedule to join the session. And thank you for panelists for
Thank
the
you
good
so
job.
much, panelists, and please a big round of applause. A fascinating conversation, and I do want to mention here that we are taking note of some of the key highlights that have been made on each session, and we will be coming out with a Cape Town conversation declaration that we will be putting forth to the Think 20 in Brazil to take some of these points forward. So don't worry, we have noted down some of the highlights that were made here, and thank you so much. Please join us for a quick photograph. As we close this session, may I now announce the next one, Rising Tides, a strategy for human security in the Afro-Asian century. On the panel, we'll have Munia Bosheta from Morocco, the Senior Fellow at Policy Center for the New South, Danny Kwa, Dean, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore, Saturo Nagao, Fellow, Hudson Institute, Kayode Fayemi, former Governor of the Ekiti State, and moderator Lin Kwok from IISS in Singapore. We're just getting the stage ready, speakers. Thank you so much for joining us. Please, the stage is ready. Rising Tides, Strategy for Human Security in the Afro-Asian Century. We'll talk about how the two continents can partner together and find pathways for progress. Moderator, you're ready? Thank you.
Thank you very much. A very warm welcome to everyone in this session, Strategies for Human Security in the Afro-Asian Century. My name is Lin Kwok, and I'm Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. The Asian and African continents enjoy immense economic opportunities. Asia is widely considered to be the center of gravity for economic affairs, and the African Continental Free Trade Area, once fully implemented, is expected to be the 5th largest economy in the world with a potential combined gross domestic product of more than $3.4 trillion. With rising economic powers, countries across these continents are also poised to play an increasingly influential role in shaping global affairs. Their potential is also enhanced by great power competition for influence in the global south. Yet amidst this vast potential, there are also challenges. Amongst them, the quest for human security, a concept that recognizes that security must mean more than the security of the state. Human security emphasizes the security and well-being of individuals, recognizing that threats to people's lives, their livelihoods, and dignity come from a variety of sources ranging from violence, whether in the form of armed conflict or crime, poverty, disease, environmental degradation, or suppression of political rights. This panel seeks to explore whether and how a united Afro-Asian approach can do more to safeguard and enhance human security. The panelists were already introduced earlier, but let me quickly do so again. Monica Busetta, who's Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, Morocco. Dr. Danny Kwa, who's Dean at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. Dr. Satoru Nagao, who's a non-resident fellow at the Hudson Institute in Japan. and Dr. Kayode Fayemi, who is former governor of the Ekiti State, Nigeria. Very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining me. Danny, let's start with you. Could you tell us how an Afro-Asian approach to human security might differ from the current approach?
Thank you, Lynn, for that question, and thank you all for sharing this afternoon with us in this discussion. Lynn, you've asked me a very difficult question, one that ranges from what happens to individuals for human security, where our concerns are, as you say, basic rights, freedom from hunger, safety in the streets, education, health, to the Afro-Asian century, the possibility of an Afro-Asian century. As we know, the Afro-Asian continent encompasses over 5 billion people. So we're talking at the same time about how something very big can affect something very small. No less consequential, but something that's on a much smaller, more micro scale. I think when we think about these things, what we have to do is to try and understand what happens at the very large, overarching Afro-Asian level filters down to what happens at an individual security level. So let me suggest that there are some ways to think about this. Let me just talk actually about one way to think about this, but then describe ideas that we might have for how we make robust that connection between the Afro-Asian century and individual human security. At the end of that, we will, I think, come to some agreement about what the structure, how that structure operates. But I would like to leave us with some thoughts about principles that we could use to continue to regulate this relation. So one easy way to think about how this relation works is how much does each individual control their own destiny and their environment? How much protection do they get afforded by the state wherever they might live? The idea that an Afro-Asian continent has bearing on individual human security must come from the view that as a community, the Afro-Asian continent can do more for its people than if each individual nation of the Afro-Asian continent stood by itself. There must be the idea that community matters. And so when we think about how we bring about an Afro-Asian century to better provide for human security, we must be thinking about ways in which, by standing together, the whole can do more than the sum of its parts. In other words, we're talking about an Afro-Asian century or an Afro-Asian community. We're not talking about a century of a long list of individual nations. We're talking about an integrated entity. Now, in doing this, what we must do is we realize that we're relying on the idea that each nation, by standing together with others, can achieve more than if it stands by itself. Each nation, by standing with the others, must develop a relation of trust so that it can specialize in doing the things that it does best, but allow others to do the things that they do best and engage in some kind of trustful exchange. The way we can achieve that, it seems to me, is twofold. We can think about how today the international community builds trust across nations. And that twofold way is reflected both in what I think we can build for an Afro-Asian century, as well as reflected in the international institutions we see today. The first of these is build structures, contracts, explicit agreements, and treaties that put in trust and confidence building as one of its ingredients. When we do that, our nation gets into a relationship with a different nation, and we can both advance better together. So the first idea, build structures of trust, build confidence. The second idea is that the way the international community has historically provided for this trust across nations is to set up rule of law, international rule of law, systems of rules that implicitly bring about inadvertent cooperation. Structures that build confidence and trust allow my nation to work with your nation in an explicit collaboration. An international rule of law allows my nation to work with your nation in an inadvertent cooperation, even without explicit treaties. So I think if we're going to be building an Afro-Asian community for an Afro-Asian century, we've got to come up with some way to bring about a mix of these two ideas: structures for explicit trust, or a system of rules of an Afro-Asian community that has a rule of law that allows us to inadvertently cooperate with one another. These two structures, by the way, structures for trust and structures of rule of law, are what already exist in the world today. But many of us feel they don't work well enough. We think about tearing them down and replacing them, or we worry that they put in place a tilted playing field that advantages one side of the world rather than another. So if we go forwards, building an Afro-Asian community for an Afro-Asian century, we've got to put in place principles that prevent this distortion from happening. Let me take 30 seconds and tell you what my ideas of those principles are. The first principle is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We today are in a situation where the international system is changing for geopolitical rivalry. We today are trying to figure out how to navigate an increasingly fragmented landscape. Don't wait until all of this resolves, until all of us can see a way clear through before we start building an Afro-Asian community. Don't let the perfect stand in the way of the good. The second principle is go with what works. Even if you don't think it's ideal, that's of course the same reflection of the same idea. But let me give you an example. If we put in place a plank of operation for our community that helps lift the marginalized, the weak and vulnerable in my nation, I should not let it bother me that it helps some other nations even more. Don't go into this building of an Afro-Asian community with a zero-sum mindset. Anything that helps, helps. Then my third principle, and I'll end here, is constantly look for ways to make the system better. If you begin with the idea of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, you've already put in place something that works. Don't be afraid to change it. In a world where revisionism can improve things, revisionism should be welcomed. Don't defend the international system or the Afro-Asian system that we are building in case we are simply holding on to a rule that we think works. Constantly innovate on our community. So I'd like to leave us with those three principles for how we take things forward. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you so much, Danny. I really liked how you highlighted that the assumption that an Afro-Asian approach might work better, underlying that assumption is the sense that a community works better than the individual nation, and that's a very important takeaway, I think, from what you just said. You talked about building structures of trust. One thing that struck me from the discussion this morning was how the South African Minister of International Relations and Cooperation highlighted that there are 20 armed conflicts, ongoing armed conflicts on the African continent. This figure really struck me, and I actually went away to fact check it, not because I didn't believe the minister, I just thought I might have misheard the amount because it seemed so high to me. But when I checked it, I looked up what came up first in terms of the searches was the Geneva Academy statistic, which must have used a different methodology for what constitutes an armed conflict. And it said that there are 35 ongoing armed conflicts in the African continent. Now, turning now to you, let me try to pronounce this correctly, Kayode. Do you think it's possible to build trust across the African and Asian continents if at home there appears to be so little trust as would be apparent from the armed conflicts waging in this continent?
Thank you, Lynn, and it's really a pleasure to be part of this panel. Yes, generally we say that charity begins at home before you start reaching out to helping others. But in this case, you need to define what home is. The world that we live in is not a world in which the home is just constricted to the geographic space within which you exist. Because what affects your neighbor or even countries further afield can undermine your own human security objectives. And particularly so in a world that is in a state of flux. If you look at history, there's no way we can talk about the Afro-Asian century without casting our mind back to Bandung, 1955, and where that unity of purpose was utilized in the decolonization campaign and project. But at that particular time too, we were responding to a shift in geopolitics, in the global power relations. The 1945, post-1945 world order was emerging. The decolonization project was on. At the time that the meeting in Bandung took place, many countries on the African continent were not even, quote and unquote, independent or liberated. But leaders of Africa at the time, the Kwame Nkrumahs of this world, the Julius Nyerere, and a number of them were very clear that the Afro-Asian world needed to work together without facing east or west. In fact, the way Kwame Nkrumah put it in the first non-aligned movement meeting was that we should neither face the east nor the west. We should face forward. And we're back to that particular moment in time in which replacing the machinations of the West with the machinations of the East is not the solution to the global challenges that we face, but ensuring that we work together to build trust, on the one hand, as Danny has said, but also to organize the world in such a manner that we all live far removed from freedom from fear and freedom from want, which ultimately is where we have, with global governance initiative that can ensure that the spirit that drives us in Africa, Ubuntu, as we've all spoken, does not conceive of the world as a me, myself, and me alone, but the world in a broader context, as Danny has highlighted. So that has to be reflected in the shift that we have ongoing. But in that Gramscian moment in which the old is dying and the new is not yet born, we're bound to witness a lot of confusion. I don't think we should run away from those confusions. I think we should try and find the pathway that would enable the world to hold itself accountable. And if the bulk of the world population, which is in the Afro-Asian section of the world is not in the driver's seat as co-rule makers, then we're not going to address all of the challenges that we've highlighted. And the Indian G20 leadership helped in addressing that by pushing for the African Union to be at the table as a co-rule maker. What we now need to do on our part, on the African continent, is get our act together and build an African Union that is responsive, that is accountable, and that ensures that the national strategies are organized in a manner that we don't respond to these issues as individual countries, which is the problem. So in doing that, we must strengthen the regional economic communities to also play their role as regional security initiatives. ECOWAS did this when we had challenges in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, and SADC did it in Congo, and we need to do more of that. But we need to strengthen national capacities in order to strengthen continental responsibility. That's one. Two, when you look at the direction in which demography is moving, Asia and Africa also need to work a lot more complementarily. I mean, the median age in Africa in the next 30 years, even now, it's 19. In India, it's 28. In China, it's 38. That has implications for what we're discussing in terms of skills development, in terms of migratory effect. And we can begin to organize in a manner that that is a win-win for all the players, rather than the way we see migration as a negative now in many parts of the world. And I believe that the Brazilian leadership of the G20 has to have this as one of the major issues to focus on. I also think it's absolutely important, as we're talking about human security, to address the structural drivers in the transformation agenda. Poverty, inequality are the structural drivers of conflict in many of our states. Africans don't just wake up to pick up guns to say they want to kill one another. We must look at this beyond just the neoliberal democratic framework that is really not delivering the goods in many of our countries and is now triggering conflicts, coup d'etats, insurgency, extremism of all types. So if we don't address the structural drivers of conflict in poverty, in inequality, perhaps in the way that it's been done in many Asian countries, and learn some lessons from that, we may not be able to fundamentally play that role as co-rule makers. We will still be corralled, either by the East, in all of the invitations that Minister Pando was talking about. We get dragged to Washington this month for meeting with Biden, and the next month we go to Belt and Road Initiative in China, and we leave there, we go to St. Petersburg for the Russian dimension of that, without really deciding amongst ourselves what is our own agenda. The people we're going to meet have agenda, short, medium, long term. We must also define our own agenda and develop a strategic framework that is not based on individual countries' principles. That, for me, would be first principles there.
Thanks so much. I think what I took away from that is that perhaps, the bridging between, creating a bridge between Africa and Asia in terms of that community might also lead to positive externalities within Africa, and the greater ability or the enhanced ability to build Africa's own agenda, right? So that increases bonding ties as well. So both bridging as well as bonding ties are increased as a result of this Afro-Asian community. I'll turn now to Munia, and thank you for your patience. Munia, you've held various government positions. You were Secretary of State to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Morocco. You've worked in the Ministry of Industry and Trade. As a practical matter, how might we arrive at a joint Afro-Asian approach or a community, perhaps by virtue of greater economic integration, which Coyote also mentioned earlier?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lynn, for giving me this opportunity, and I want also to thank the organizer for giving me this possibility to participate to this important conference. As you say, the human security is, of course, related to stability, and stability is related to prosperity and development. And the issues of economic issues are very important to address the question of human security. And as you know, Africa and Asia represent groups of diverse countries, each variable population and variable geographies and structure of economy and highly variable GDP per capita. So we are sharing the same issues and the same challenges. And by the next century, we know that 80% of global population is expected to live in Africa or Asia. And to tackle the big challenges like human security, it's important to consider the trend of demographics. And that means that we have to consider a united approach, innovative approach, inclusive approach, taking into consideration both Africa and Asian nations to address or to generate sustainable solutions. So in practical manner, I will highlight which kind of economic relation we can build between African and Asian nations, because that is very important to create conditions for development and for human security. And I think there is opportunity to develop the global value chain and to be a major player in a global value chain, but that means that we have to reorganize or to create new approach of collaboration and partnership at economic level. First, we know that Africa is a market of raw materials, and we have more than 80% that are exported. And Asia are also Asian nations are also providing technology, and that is, it seems that to be very complementary economies. But it's not enough. If you want to generate added value, if you want to be competitive in sustainable manner, it is important to change the way how we are building our partnership and how we can create a more balanced cooperation. That means that we have to invest at, I think, 4 levels. The first one, how can we improve the investment or foreign investment and targeting more added value, especially in agribusiness, in industry, in services, and create more opportunities, more diversify our economy. Until now, we know that our relation between African nations and Asian nations are very limited to investment in extractive industry or exportation of raw materials, but there is no generation of real added value. And if we invest more on that, it will mean that we'll have both opportunities, both for African and Asian countries, and that will create, of course, many opportunities of employment for population, and that means that there is more prosperity. Other point, in my sense, is how we can create connectivity. Because even that we multiply investment and trade between our countries, without connectivity, without infrastructure development, without diversifying or expanding our network of transportation, creating more digital platform and harmonizing our policies and standards, it will not benefit to our economy because there will be all-time barriers to that. So to be more practical, I think we have some issues that we have where we can cooperate, we can create more opportunities. The third point should be how we can develop the human capital by, even that we have demography in Africa, but we need skilled people, so we can develop more programs for scholarships, for transfer of technology, capacity building. And that should be very important to support what we have as ambition, how we can address global challenges, how we can address global issues. If you don't have skilled people, prepared people, it will not be possible. And the fourth point, the last point, should be governance, of course, and climate business. We have, as African countries, we have a lot to learn from Asian experience, and I think that should be one big issue, I think, where we can cooperate, where we can learn from each other. So as Moroccan, we strongly believe that integration is key issue to development. It means that we should invest on integration as continental level. For that reason, free trade agreements we support it because we consider that will help and foster the development to that, but also how we can create sustainable bridges with other continents like Asian nations where we can we have common market to address, and we, as I said, we can have a major role to play. So that's, for me, are very important issues where we can work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, connectivity, I think you highlighted, and I think if we talk about an Afro-Asian century of forging stronger ties, connectivity is really at the heart of that endeavor. You know, we hear in the media a lot about the various connectivity plans that various powers have put forward. The US has a version, Europe has the Global Gateway, China has its Belt and Road Initiative. You know, the US and Europe have come together to work on their collective initiative as well. Of those various initiatives, what do you think which do you see as the most prevalent on the African continent? And do you see a need to forge partnerships with any other countries in particular as well?
Okay, thank you. I think what we need is to consolidate our partnership. If we have partners that came with added value, it's very important, and sharing the same values, that will be necessary, because it's not a question of having more actors around the table, but it's how we can generate added value, how can we go faster. And that's, I think, it will be very important. And if we have a partner that could support us, that will be very benefit.
And when you talk about values, what do you mean in particular?
Values, also what we are sharing, we have to contribute and to have partnership in sustainable value, respecting human, respecting our freedom, and respecting also what we have as resources. So that's, I think, it's very important in the relations. Thank you.
Satoru-san, thank you for your patience. We heard this morning about the very fraught geopolitical landscape and its worrying implications for Africa. And of course, you know, in the context of infrastructure development, we've seen that geopolitical competition play out. How, in your view, might geopolitical developments, in particular great power competition, hurt or even help the ability to forge an effective and durable Afro-Asian approach to human security?
Fortunately, I have two choices, but I need to choose one. Okay, human security is a topic, and my background is national security. That's why I want to talk about the relation between two. So in this case, your question is perfectly matched with my specialty. Indeed, in 1990s, human security was very popular. Why? Because national security cannot cover some important issue of the security. That's why human security is important. But I need to say, without national security, there is no human security. So in the national security, what happened recently? Indeed, the most important situation or issue is friend or enemy. Especially since Russia's aggression in Ukraine, many countries demand which side. And especially since China's aggressive activity in the Indo-Pacific, yes, countries demand which side. But this issue, not only focusing on national security issue, indeed covering every security-related issue. For example, the leaking water from Fukushima nuclear plant. This is not a defense military issue, but now Japan mixed with seawater, and this water is very safe. IAEA checking again, and the US ambassador comes to Fukushima, ate fish from this area, or the Australian ambassador came, or EU removes the ban, or even if South Korea, which blame Japan every time, is a restriction to import fish from here. But despite this, China banned to import fish from Japan. And 1 month later, Russia followed this action. Why? Fact, this is safe. But fact is not the matter. Friend or enemy is the matter. So that's why if the enemy say this is orange, enemy's friend say this is orange, despite this is apple. That is the current world. So infrastructure project, same situation. Asia, Africa growth corridor, which is India and Japan project, or Indo-Pacific vision, Blue Dot Network. These are the US side, Japan side vision against China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. So, but in this case, which side you are is very important. So, unfortunately, this is the situation, and this is the situation we need to exploit it. So, viewed from the Japan's experience after the World War II, we can compare the US occupation and the Soviet occupation. And we understand that US is better than Soviet, because Soviet troops come to the shop and start to eat. And the shopkeeper asks the Soviet soldier, could you please pay? The Soviet soldier puts a gun and kills the shop owner. So that is common. That's why we start to understand the US side was better because of the occupation, because of we lost the war in the World War II. So that's why we want to talk about people in South Africa. It is understandable South African people take distance from the West because former colonial master or the cause of the apartheid is Western countries. But at the same time, I want to say South African people is courageous people, strong people, and the people to change the history finally to get proper human right. So that's why, as a Japanese, I wish to say, South Africa choose the right side. So what do I want to say is join us. That's all. Thank you very much.
Perhaps before I turn to Q&A from the floor, I'd like to turn again to Coyote to ask whether or not your sense is similar to my colleague's sense over here about how China is a threat to Africa. That's the first question. I mean, I'd like you to address this quite quickly, whether China is perceived as a threat or more as a contributor to human security in the African continent. And second, perhaps you could also address whether you think great power competition has diverted resources away from the African continent or has instead increased attention to the African continent where you have superpowers competing to be benefactor and even more generous to Africa?
Thank you. Well, I think we are at a point of inflection, and it presents opportunities for Africa. Frankly, I think the word to use will be the opportunity for strategic autonomy, which is not very different from what the foundational leaders of Africa pushed for at Bandung and the non-aligned movement. It's the same agenda that the post-millennium leaders, President Mbeki, Abdoulaye Wade, Obasanjo, pushed in the new Partnership for Africa Development and the Africa Renaissance Program. So And this principally focuses on Africa itself. What's our interest? And once we figure that out, as defined in the Africa 2063 agenda, which is to work towards a united, integrated Africa. That's aspirational, I know, but that's the beginning. You need to be clear about your objective and then work towards it. Anybody who wants to come to Africa now needs to come and figure out to contribute to that agenda, not to force Africa and African states into this competition. We clearly must define our agenda, and I think, the critical issues at the moment are not even necessarily ideological. Climate change, pandemic, these are things that are existential threats, not just to Africa, but the rest of the world. But how it affects Africa, either in vaccine production and distribution, or in other elements associated with that, is something that we need to clearly define and then work towards the best way to get African advantage. I think that's really what we should focus on. Geopolitical competition will continue. We're not going to stop it. But what is in our interest, and how do we pursue that interest as a co-rule maker, not being corralled into the agenda of either side? And I think that's really what the G20 program in India seemed to have pushed to the forefront. And global Africa, as well as global South, would need to work together in achieving this purpose. Thank you.
Thank you. So no permanent friend or enemy, if I'm hearing you correctly, but a clear sense of African interests, and then from there you determine the best means or the best partners for achieving those interests. Thank you. Now I turn to the floor. Are there any questions from the floor, please? Thank you very much. And if I could ask that you identify yourself for the audience and also state to whom your question is directed.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I'm Otilia Anamaunganidze from the Institute for Security Studies. I'm mindful that there's very little time for actual questions, so maybe just a couple of comments. The first is that there were a number of words that I hoped to hear in this session that I didn't. Those are accountability, inclusivity, equality, and justice. Seemed more focused on other aspects of human security and not those. The other two, and very briefly, is of course Asia and Africa are the two continents for which remittances have really helped development, helped communities. Would like to hear the thoughts of anyone really on how we can be able to leverage remittances into the African and Asian continents for the benefit of both. Then finally, education. If we agree that Asia and Africa are young continents, even as Africa is much younger than Asia, what do we have to say about educating not the youth, but actually right from the start? So from infancy onwards, so not focusing only when we have a discontent in the late teens, but earlier on. What do we have to say about how that can help shape the African Asia of the future? Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Yes, one more question there.
Hello, my name is Litemba Matanda, and I am in my second year of BA International Studies. And my question is general for the panel. There's a mini narrative that's being pushed in coursework that this is a new version of neo-colonialism. And I just want to ask, how can we make sure that we're not falling into that trap? And I know that you spoke about how intentions need to be set, but I think from a perspective coming from coursework, this could be seen as a way to sort of mask and subsidize a way to colonize Africa, for lack of a better phrase. So my question is, how can we level it out for people like me to understand, the youth that you've been referring to the whole day? How can we understand what you're talking about and know that we are safe?
Yes, one more. One more, please.
Hi, my name is Julia Rupnifard. I'm from the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. And my question is to Dr. Denny Kwah, if I may, and it's about Southeast Asia. But I think the same question pretty much can be extrapolated to Africa as well. So I wanted to ask how, in your opinion, the US-China rivalry in our region, in Southeast Asia, plays a role in the growing disregard for human security, or maybe you are of a different opinion and it actually benefits human security in Southeast Asia in any way. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So we have a series of questions. The lack of mention of accountability, inclusivity, and justice. I would have actually liked to ask a question related to that, like how, in coming up with a model for human security, an Afro-Asian model for human security, we bring in the best elements and leave out some of the worst. Perhaps we can have Coyote answer that question, and the question of remittances. Munia, would you like to address that? And Latia's question, who would like to address that? You could do it as well.
Thank you. I think it's an excellent question, but without holding brief for my colleagues, I think we've all assumed that those are set principles and values that have been agreed by all in mutual trust, accountability, justice. These are the values undergirding the work of this group. And I believe that it doesn't require, given the time limit that we have, any elaboration. But I do want to say one thing in respect to that. I mean, some significant development occurred, I think it was last 2 weeks, when the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, voted on the reform of the global tax regime in order to stem illicit financial flows. And if you see the way that vote went, which was 125 against 38, with all of the OECD countries voting in one direction and majority of countries in Asia and Africa voting in another direction to, of course, close all these tax havens and all these avenues for tax, for blocking tax justice in the world. And I think that speaks to the question also about remittances. Ultimately, the reform of the global governance structure, particularly the Bretton Woods institution, is one that I believe African and Asian nations pretty much agree on. And in the event that that's not possible, I think that's the role that a body like BRICS has in defining a new vehicle for ensuring this accountability in the global governance structure. And I think that's something that we really ought to be pushing very hard on here. That essentially would be my short answer to that question. But yes, the values of accountability, we must hold one another accountable. There must be peer pressure, positively, not just in the other direction, to ensure that what we're accusing the West of is not replicated by a partnership that is tilting towards the East. That really must be one thing that Africa pushes against.
Thank you. Munia, would you like to address any of those questions?
I can add some answers to what have been said, because when I highlighted 4 aspects considering the economic perspective, 2 points was related to values, and I said governance is very important, and governance with inclusivity and accountability and diversity and all the principles. The second point, it was related to human capital, and it means that we have of course, to invest in skilled people and how can you create more capacity building and different program and scholarship, what is very important. Because without human capital, we can't achieve what we have as targeted. And it was the question about the new colonialism, if you can say that, but I think that was very important, and when I addressed the perspective of economic, that we should have a balanced relationship. And this balanced relationship should not focus just on the Africa as markets of raw materials. It should be as partner with who we can create added value, we can develop agribusiness supply chain, industry, energy. So this spirit is very important, yes, to have very sustainable relations and to be engaged and committed to face all the different challenges, especially human security.
Thank you. And Satoru-san, would you like to address any of the questions? If not, I'll turn to Danny.
Maybe I haven't prepared it, but okay. Maybe when I hear the question, I realize that maybe new colonialism, the mindset of the colonial is still existing in Africa. That it's itself, maybe we should solve, I believe, because Africa is a rising region now, and Asia is a rising region now. So this means that we do not need to worry about a new type of colonialism now, because rising means that you will be the center of the world politics. That's why you do not need to worry about the experience in the past. You will lead the world, you will be part of the world, and if there is a democratic system, you can vote to decide some part of the world politics. So maybe don't worry about this. Just raise a hand and claim and get it. That is my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. So look towards the future, less towards the past. On that, we now move to Danny. The question on how the EU, or whether the EU plays a role in human security in Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Lynn. To answer that question, may I just touch on some of the other questions as well and just make 3 very quick points. First, on the question about accountability and justice. Those are obviously very important issues, but at the level that we are discussing matters here, it seems to me that we need to take an international approach, and we cannot be seen to be conjuring up constructions on an Afro-Asian century that interfere or intervene in individual nations. National sovereignty still matters, and the level at which we're discussing these things, I think there are many things that each nation will need to continue to do to fix up governance in their domestic landscapes. It's not for the international observers to pronounce on that. But that's also the same answer I would give to a number of other points, including the point about US-China rivalry. The best way forward, it seems to me, given the range of concerns that have been raised, is still multilateralism and a level playing field. And if the full-blown multilateralism across the entire international community is no longer available to us, some kind of restricted multilateralism that confines itself to the nations that are willing to enter that coalition needs to be taken forwards. That means that we respect each nation's individual national sovereignty, and we cannot meddle in the domestic affairs of individual nations. Instead, we stand on principle, and we do not allow, or we do our best not to allow external factors like US-China geopolitical rivalry and competition to impinge on our holding on to the principles of multilateralism. That, it seems to me, is the way we need to continue to approach the Afro-Asian continent and the Afro-Asian century. Thank you very much.
Thank you all, and I hope you'll join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, and I thank you all for your patience and your interest in this session.
Thank you so much to the panelists. If I could request you to join us for a quick photograph. We now have a video message from Ari Rottenbush, CEO at the ABSA Group. It's a video message on an ecosystem approach to leadership in a complex world. So if I could request my colleagues to play the video over here, and if I could request the panelists to join us for a quick photograph.
If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. This is a far-sighted African proverb, and my speech today is about the power of leadership ecosystems. Your Excellencies, the current and former heads of states and governments, honorable cabinet ministers and other senior government officials, Your Excellency, the former president and the patron of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, CEO Mr. Max Botkwana, and esteemed trustees of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, distinguished representatives of the Observer Research Foundation, distinguished academics and honored guests from across sectors and nations, ladies and gentlemen. Greetings to all of you. It is with great respect and a deep sense of honor that I address you today through this recording. While I regret not being able to be there in person, I am immensely proud to be part of this groundbreaking platform, a visionary collaboration between the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the Observer Research Foundation. A forum that combines knowledge and innovation with shared commitment, establishing a critical hub for collaborative dialogue amidst our dynamic, internationally cooperative environment. I wish to express my profound appreciation to both the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the Observer Research Foundation. Their exceptional efforts and collaboration have brought to life this significant forum here in South Africa. Their visionary dedication in organizing such an event truly reflects their unwavering commitment to fostering dialogue, knowledge exchange, and collaboration on a global scale. This forum is indeed more than just a confluence of ideas. It truly represents a conscious shift from traditional binaries of global north and south. As leaders from various countries and spheres of society, government, civil society, and business, we have come together to underscore and recommit to the crucial role of leadership in steering global affairs and steadfastly building a sustainable and better future for all. It is a necessary pursuit to transform international policies and harness innovative solutions to challenges that transcend borders. Our beautiful continent of Africa, and indeed all other emerging markets, look to us to forge paths of prosperity and stability. We find ourselves at a crucial juncture, arguably the most complex and challenging in our history, where our leadership is being tested, perhaps more than ever before. This compels us to ponder deeply what form of leadership is required to navigate through the multidimensional challenges our world currently grapples with, and how will such leadership effectively address them? Navigating our shared future demands a reimagined perspective on leadership. We need a framework that is rooted in a deep understanding of the interplay between leadership and ecosystems, especially given the complex challenges the world faces. This brings me to the concept of ecosystemic leadership, a model that does not seek solutions in isolation, but through a vibrant network of stakeholders. It is an approach that propels us to understand and acknowledge that no singular entity nor person possesses the entirety of solutions to the multifaceted challenges we, as a global society, confront. In essence, we need a significant shift in leadership thinking towards one that is more inclusive, interconnected, and geared towards collaborative problem solving for the complex challenges of our modern world. Ecosystems in their essence represent a symbiotic, cohesive existence. They depict a reality where each element, be it flora, fauna, or the prevailing climate, functions collaboratively, each dependent on the other, ensuring systemic survival and functionality. The fragility of this interdependence indicates that a failure or success within one component has ripple effects across the entire system. This means that every element of the ecosystem depends on another, directly or indirectly, making the entire system functional. And failure by one element has repercussions for the entire ecosystem. In much the same way, our societal structures, be it leadership, economic mechanisms, political institutions, or governance frameworks, operate in a complex interplay of interdependence, similar to the natural ecosystem. Just as flora depends on the prevailing climate, the health of our economic systems is contingent upon sound leadership and stable governance. A disturbance in any part, whether it is political instability or economic downturns, can send shockwaves throughout the entire societal fabric. The resilience and prosperity of our society hinge on the harmonious functioning and mutual support of each of these interconnected pillars. If one falters, it necessitates swift adaptation and collaboration amongst the others to restore balance and ensure the collective well-being. The paradigm of ecosystemic leadership, wherein the interconnectedness of organizational sustainability is emphasized, is not merely a concept, but an imperative in our current global scenario. Recognizing this interconnected approach means that as leaders, hailing from diverse backgrounds, nations, professions, organizations, and sectors, we must acknowledge our mutual dependency. Our unique perspectives and strengths, when woven together, can drive transformative change and address global challenges more effectively. In this interconnected world, leaders from all walks of life and sectors of society are not isolated entities, but essential parts of a greater whole. And we need each other more than ever before. This collective strength underscores the essence of ecosystemic leadership, pushing us to collaborate, innovate, and sustainably lead our organizations and communities. Understanding leadership as an ecosystem requires us to visualize leadership not as a singular entity, but a vibrant network of interconnected stakeholders, each contributing their unique capabilities, insights, and solutions to our collective challenges and aspirations. Ecosystemic leadership transcends beyond strategies and enters the arena of values, ensuring that every decision, big or small, is navigated through a lens that harmonizes economic growth with ecological and social sustainability. It implores us to look beyond immediate gains and explore an horizon where every action echoes with sustainability, inclusivity, and shared prosperity. It is a leadership that does not merely adapt to change, but becomes the harbinger of change, molding a future that is resilient, sustainable, and inclusive. As we stand at the crossroads of challenges and opportunities, the essence of ecosystemic leadership evolves from a singular melody to a collective symphony, where every note, every tone, and every melody contributes towards a harmonious future. What this implies is that our aspirations for a sustainable and inclusive future are not defined by our individual capacities, but by our collective actions, our shared responsibilities, and our unified objectives. This collective vision ties deeply into our inherent interconnectedness of our continent's ecosystem, and it is within this framework that our dialogue today finds its roots. The ecosystem of our continent is vast and varied, and like any thriving ecosystem, it requires a balance of diverse elements to flourish. Similarly, for our collective aspirations to be realized, we need a multifaceted approach to leadership that understands and respects this diversity. Ecosystemic leadership stands at the forefront of this approach. It compels us to reinvent multilateral approaches, ensuring they are rooted in inclusivity and effectiveness. By harnessing adaptive and collaborative styles of leadership, we can bolster the strength and responsiveness of multilateral institutions. The goal is not just to navigate the complex web of global challenges, but also to proactively mitigate them. A significant component of this ecosystemic leadership, especially in our African context, is the recognition of the essential role of women. The inclusion of women in leadership roles, particularly in steering the path towards sustainable development, cannot be understated. Their unique abilities to foster community spirit, drive collaboration, and champion sustainability play a pivotal role in bringing about transformative changes, not just within organizations, but across national boundaries as well. While it is essential to recognize and champion the roles of different players within our ecosystem, it is equally vital to remember our shared responsibility towards the planet. As we move forward, leading with an ecological conscience becomes non-negotiable. We must confront both the opportunities and challenges that come with transitioning to a green economy, always ensuring that our processes remain equitable, inclusive, and respectful of diverse capacities and strengths of nations. There are many more other different facets to ecosystemic leadership, and by understanding and embracing them, we can truly hope to navigate our shared future with foresight, unity, and purpose. As the CEO of the ABSA Group, which operates across various markets on the continent and other geographies, I carry with me not just the emblem of a financial institution, but the ethos of an organization deeply embedded in the principle of ecosystemic leadership. Our organizational purpose of empowering Africa's tomorrow together, one story at a time, is not merely a slogan, but a compass that guides our operational and strategic outlook. We believe in working with like-minded partners, such as the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the Observer Research Foundation, and many others, to achieve a greater impact in co-creating the kind of society we all desire. At ABSA, we strive to embody the principles of ecosystemic leadership in our everyday operations and our strategic initiatives. Our commitments stretch beyond our organizational boundaries, permeating our engagements with communities and the environment. Our actions, whether initiating green banking products, investing in sustainable projects, or collaborating with partners on them, reflect our unwavering commitment to responsible practices and development. In closing, I wish you a successful and insightful gathering, filled with meaningful discussions that will guide us forward in these challenging times. This conversation does not merely symbolize a conference, it epitomizes a collective stride towards global harmony, equitable development, and a sustainable future. ABSA stands firm in its commitment to be an active participant and contributor in this collaborative journey. President Thabo Mbeki, you once said, open quote, "Dream of the realization of the unity of Africa, whereby its leaders combine in their efforts to solve the problems of this continent." Close quote. Let us pledge today to transform our collective symphony into a harmonious future where every entity, individual, and nation contributes towards our shared aspirations and collective prosperity. Thank you.
With that, we come to a close of this particular segment of Cape Town Conversation. We break for 10 minutes for a cup of tea. You can please freshen up, stretch your legs, and then we reconvene in the same room in 10 minutes. Thank you so much. The tea coffee machine is now open. Please grab a cup. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. If I could request my colleagues to start ushering people in. We start in 5 minutes. किसका है ये लिखा? कैसे पता चलेगा? बंद हुआ पड़ा। ओके। Good evening, everyone. We start the next session in 2 minutes. But before we start the next session, we do have an address from the resident coordinator of the UN in South Africa. I have two housekeeping announcements to make. The first is somebody's left their mobile phone by the desk over there. So, and now it's ringing. So if you want to collect your mobile phone, please do take it from us over there on the corner table next to the production desk. Last evening, somebody also left their glasses. We have those as well. So you can catch us. Spectacles, I can show them to you post the session, and then you can have a look if they're yours. Sukhmani, if I could request you to please usher in the delegates. Before we start the session, as I mentioned, we do have a video message from Nelson Mufu, the UN resident coordinator in South Africa. If I could request my colleagues to have the video up.
Honorable Ministers, Your Excellencies, representatives from the private sector, academia, think tanks, and civil society, former President Thabo Mbeki, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, greetings. Whilst I had hoped to join you in person, I am grateful for the opportunity to share a few words of welcome and encouragement to all of you. First and foremost, allow me to congratulate my friend Samir and the Observer Research Foundation colleagues, my friend Max and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation colleagues, and other partners and sponsors on co-convening this most noteworthy, impactful, and timely event. The United Nations in South Africa, and indeed India, see the value of such strategic engagements and is proud to partner and accompany you in this groundbreaking inaugural conference, focused on the aspirations and endeavors of developing countries and peoples within an increasingly polarized world, coping with the polycrisis. The journey of collaboration, exploration, and innovation does not end when the conversations end. Indeed, it is when the hard work of advancing solutions, forging collaborations, convincing detractors, leveraging champions, implementing frameworks, mobilizing resources and capacities, and actioning innovation begins in earnest. We are all here with a collective purpose to participate in and push forward a platform dedicated to shaping our world's future through foresight, anticipatory action, innovative solutions, fresh perspectives, and robust partnerships. As we transition towards a multipolar world, the United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, has emphasized that we need strong and effective multilateral institutions with the United Nations as the cornerstone. Effective multilateralism is one of the driving forces behind the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the recently released Complementary Secretary General's report, Our Common Agenda. Both documents envision a multilateralism that is more inclusive, with space for the contributions of all countries and communities, a more networked ecosystem with strong links and global partnerships forged through the United Nations family with international financial institutions, regional organizations, trading blocs, civil society, and others. Friends, this is a time of significant change, a time when the center of gravity of international decision-making for people and planet is shifting, with South Africa chairing the current and incoming BRICS presidency and the G20 Troika led by developing countries. This paradigm shift presents an opportunity to reposition the Global South and its aspirations as the primary driver of international policy discourse. As the narrative of the North-South fades, we must ensure it is replaced by a shared understanding that our futures are interconnected and our solutions must be equitable, collective, collaborative, and mutually beneficial. We need strong multilateral institutions to respond with effectiveness to the post-pandemic socioeconomic recovery, as well as the unfolding polycrisis that the world is confronting. Aggravating climate impacts, poverty, unemployment, food insecurity, inequalities, intolerance, debt distress, and communal tensions. And that is leaving the most vulnerable countries and populations at risk or behind. This is particularly true for Africa. We are at the midpoint of the pathway to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The 2023 Sustainable Development Goals Summit last September in New York stressed that there is an urgent need for redoubling our efforts, particularly to advance 6 transitions with regards to climate change, education, jobs, digitization, food systems, and energy, all underpinned by an SDG stimulus, a financing package to deliver what we've promised the world. Only 15% of the SDG targets are on track, with about 30% showing no progress at all. Definitely, we are not on a critical path to accelerate collaborations and actions to meet the targets for 2030. We need to course correct. The 6 transitions I mentioned are themselves intimately interconnected, requiring actions that pull levers spanning economic, social, and environmental dimensions. All of these transitions are incorporated in the thematic pillars of the Cape Town conversations, from making multilateralism deliver, to reclaiming peace, to women-led development, to achieving just transition in a green manner that will help us also advance and leverage data for development. Ladies and gentlemen, these are not abstract concepts, but an opportunity to shape real-world policies that will affect real people's lives. Let us be guided by humanity, empathy, equity, and a shared rights-based commitment to a better world. Congratulations once again on the inaugural Cape Town Conversations. Africa has indeed a central role to play in a new world order. It is a continent with clear aspirations, massive potential, and a youthful and sizable population, resources, as well as clear interests. Allow me to close with a unanimous marching order that emerged from the recent SDG Summit. May the deliberations this year, and certainly in coming years, be bold, ambitious, accelerated, and transformative actions towards a more inclusive, just, peaceful, resilient, and sustainable world for peace and planet. I wish you well, and I thank you once again.
With that, we now move to the next session, Navigating Data for Sustainable Development. May I invite the speakers on stage, Mr. Anil Chaudhary, Policy Advisor, A2I, Government of Bangladesh, Baratang Mia, Founder and CEO, Girl Hype Women Who Code, Prerna Mukharia, Founder, Outline India, Rogers Dilwayo, Senior Economic Advisor at UNDP, moderated by Alison Gilwald, Executive Director, Research ICT Africa. Please do take your seats. And before I hand it to the moderator, just one quick housekeeping announcements. We found a pair of glasses and a mobile phone. In case this belongs to you, please meet us on the corner over there. Thank you. Navigating Data for Sustainable Development, Opportunities and Challenges. Alison, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining the session, and thank you for the absolutely appropriate introduction from Nelson Mufo. I think the issues of importance of global cooperation, if we're going to deal with some of the data for development challenges that we face, are very well put in the things that he's spoken about. And just to say that, I think we've been speaking about data for development for some time. We've been speaking about, digital economies and data economies for some time. But I think, now this is what the economy is. This is what development is actually about. It's the underpinnings of, multiple aspects of public service delivery, of trade, of taxation. Everything is kind of requiring that we have better data, collect better data, use our data, and very importantly, have access to this data. I think it's become such a critical issue that it's been the focus of a number of global and multilateral and development bank initiatives over the last few years. Nelson was mentioning the importance of it in the Secretary General's Common Agenda, or the UN's Common Agenda, and particularly the Secretary General's mandate to look at a global digital compact for improved equity and development and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I think if we also look at the work of UNCTAD over the past few years, the Digital Economy Report has been looking very closely at issues around data governance and the importance of creating more equitable access to data for economic development and for trade. The World Bank report on information lives, data lives for the poor, also looking at the potential of data to provide a basis during COVID when it was published, but definitely in economic, post-COVID economic reconstruction, the importance of data in building a new social compact. So I think it's very appropriate that we're discussing this today. I think what's been highlighted in the global aspects of this is that although many of us are dealing with this and have been dealing with data and data governance and collection of data through our old traditional public statistics and those sorts of things, many of the challenges we face today require global cooperation. They require multilateral solutions if we are going to address them. And I think there's been a lot of emphasis on the harms that we know are associated with data-driven technologies, the breaches that have been very much emphasized around privacy and security. And in the context of an African conversation and a Cape Town conversation, I think it's just really important to highlight the uneven impact of those harms, particularly with vulnerable people, particularly with people who by exclusion from this data economy, from this data knowledge base, are invisible in these databases. But more importantly, and perhaps that's what we will be able to get onto today, because a lot of the data governance has focused on these breaches, these harms, privacy, is to also look at the uneven distribution of opportunities. And that really requires economic regulation of access to data, competition rules, those kinds of things. At the moment, we're looking at an enormous concentration of the data economy, of the AI economy, between two nations. Two nations of the world make hold over 80% of the revenues. That's China and the United States, or the United States and China. And very little. Africa has particularly little. The European Union, lots of people have very little, but Africa has a tiny, tiny sub-fraction of 1% on that. About 70% of the data flows out of the continent. Over 70% flows out of the continent. So what can we do, at a continental level? I think, as I said, we've had lots of discussions about the need for the AU to become more accountable and transparent and perform its role on the continent. Its membership in the G20 is terribly exciting in that it coincides with a lot of opportunities that have arisen out of Agenda 2063, and particularly in the area of data, a mandate from the Digital Transformation Strategy to develop an African Union data policy framework. And this was done last year. It's a really massive scope document. I think it's relatively progressive. And it really is important in that it's not just about data protection, it's about data governance, it's about governing both personal and non-personal data, and particularly taking these window of opportunities that we have, recognizing that free flows of data are absolutely critical to the African continental free trade area, to a number of things that we're wanting to happen on the continent. So in that context, and also just to acknowledge that unlike a lot of Digital Services Act and all of those sorts of things, it acknowledges some of the foundational challenges we have. It acknowledges the need for foundational infrastructures and will align very much with tomorrow's discussion on digital public infrastructures and the need to ensure access to data, recognizing data as a public good that has value, not only commercial value, but also public value creation. So in that context, perhaps we can just start by looking at some of the ways in which data-driven initiatives in your various companies and countries could support greater inclusivity, to increase the visibility of marginalized people and communities in the data, and also, of course, create opportunities so that people can generate that value from data. So Anir Chowdhury, Policy Advisor for the Government of Bangladesh. I know you've got this very exciting A2I project. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about whether that is achieving these kinds of objectives.
Alison, thank you. I think you've outlined the way we've been dealing with data and using data for policy making and making decisions. Now, for the last 3-4 years within the government of Bangladesh, we started this program called Data Leadership. Now, data leadership looks at how to make better use of data from many different sources, not only the traditional survey-based data, but also data from administrative sources, data from user-generated sources. And that actually gave us a roadmap for very exciting possibilities, which we were able to apply during COVID, interestingly. So COVID brought data to the center stage because we needed data every day to make decisions about health, about school closures, about lockdowns, about everything, pretty much. So one of the data sources we looked at that time, and I want to emphasize that, how when your back is against the wall, how you look at alternative data sources with open arms, which you don't when your back is not against the wall. So we didn't have RT-PCR labs in the country. We had one lab in a country of 170 million people. So what we did was we opened up our helpline, 333, and asked people to do self-reporting of symptoms. And that's the data that we used. People's own reports cleaned up by artificial intelligence with the telcos, and then called by hundreds of doctors to verify whether people were really sick. And that's how we actually created concentrations, or heat maps, of whether the disease was progressing the fastest. And that's how we made decisions for at least 4 to 6 months before the PCR labs were available. Just last 2 months ago, at the UN General Assembly, we published a report that we called Equality Report for Inclusion, for Inclusive Innovation. So E-quality. And that looks at data for inclusion, specifically on digital divide. So we looked at 4 underrepresented, marginalized populations. We looked at women. You know that women are actually underrepresented in the digital world. Call it financial inclusion, call it mobile access, call it anything. Healthcare access, using digital access. So they're always underrepresented. So that's the first category. Second is persons with disability. Third is the extreme poor, people who don't have access to cell phones, even. And the last category, which was surprising for us, is the cottage industry. So the informal industry, which forms 80+% of the economy, really. But they're not digital. So those are the 4 categories that we started looking at, and we realized that we don't have data for them. We don't even know what we don't know. And there are 3 areas in that report that we look at. One is access, so basically connectivity. Second is skills. We used to call these skills as digital skills. Now we said that it's increasingly becoming AI skills because people are actually talking to devices. They're not typing on devices anymore. So it's the digital literacy is at a completely different level. So digital literacy as we know it is going to disappear to be replaced by AI literacy. And the third area is the issue of designing digital services. So the way we design services, sometimes it creates what Amartya Sen used to call adverse digital incorporations. We actually are creating more exclusion when we try to do inclusion. And one example is the digital services that we have created for the informal economy that has in many cases hurt the small enterprises, the cottage enterprises, not the small ones, cottage enterprises, because now they are under the radar. They have to get permits where they didn't have to get permits to do their work. So we're trying to now figure out what we don't know by looking at many different types of data. And that's I think it's very exciting work. It's only at the initial stage. We have a qualitative report, but we're working on a digital divide index now with Yale University and SOAS in UK to look at some of these nuances of adverse digital incorporation, the power asymmetry that exists in society. Digital sometimes worsens things, power asymmetry worsens digitization. So there are many different, very exciting possibilities that we're looking at. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Anir. And I think, importantly, we're often talking about getting access to this big data, but there's actually multiple kinds of data that we want to get to. And just to also acknowledge that, it is this public good. If we can, it's
please speak to the mic, please.
Share it, we can make it open. So
please use the mic to speak, please.
Oh, so sorry. I'm sitting on the microphone. So, Anir, sorry for that. I was just saying that's several of the points you made is that we often trying to chase the big data, which we're so invisible as a continent, but as the global south very often. But there's so many other forms of data, and meshing this data, complementary data, crowdsourcing data, getting data, as you mentioned very excitingly, from communities themselves that are reporting. This is all very, innovative ways of getting that data. And just to, emphasize that data as a public good, it's non-rivalrous, so that can be shared, you're sharing that
Creating
data
some
doesn't
sort of
mean
a
somebody
data
else.
collective.
Yeah.
From many different sources, public, private, research, even communities.
Yeah.
And use that, open that up to whoever needs it,
Absolutely.
whoever can use it.
Yeah. Now we just need to get access to the private data. Yes, please. Prerna Makaria, founder of Outline Africa. Perhaps you'd just like to repeat your surname if it doesn't sound familiar
It's
to you.
Mukharya. It's Mukharya. And Outline India, Alison. I'd love to start Outline Africa, but maybe for today we'll go with Outline
Oh,
India.
yes, sorry. I apologize for that too. Africa focused. Please go ahead, because I know you also want to speak about data collection and some exciting examples of community participation.
Right. No, thank you for that, Alison. I think it is so important that we use forums such as these to talk about data for development, evidence-based decision-making, because I feel that with AI and with technology, the developing side of the world doesn't want to talk about its developmental challenges as much. I don't know if it's a sense of embarrassment, but we don't feel as comfortable talking about the superset of the have-nots, right? 50% of humanity is still not online. I don't know how many forums are dedicated to talking about that 55% of humanity, right? And if I talk about India specifically, we're doing so well on the tech front, we're doing so well on the inclusion front, but there's so much more that still needs to be done, Alison, right? 60% of us still live in rural areas, right? And when you talk about the elderly, when you talk about children, when you talk about women, how many of those stakeholders do you think really have cell phones or have digital access, right? Or are they using that digital access for the purposes that we are here to discuss today? No, not so much. So then what is the one way of reaching out to them? Going out there, deploying people, meeting them in person, collecting data is the one way and one way alone of sort of including them. And when I talk about making our data policies more inclusive, I'm talking about farmer groups, I'm talking about kids who are not learning as much, I'm talking about healthcare centers that don't provide the best healthcare out there, right? How do you really get information from them about what's happening on the ground, right? You have to have research methods which include these supersets. And so for that reason now, we talk about participatory research. It's not about me sitting in my office in New Delhi or somebody sitting in Washington, D.C., who will come up with a research design and tell us what policies to implement or what social schemes to launch. It just doesn't work in the Indian context. I'll just take an example. We worked for a big bank very recently, and this was about climate change and how it affects vulnerable groups, specifically agrarian communities. And we came up with a list of solutions and innovations that might have worked on the ground. And then we went to the field and we started collecting data. And we realized that a lot of problems facing these farmers were very basic. They didn't have electricity, or they had basic phones. They didn't have smartphones. And so then how do you sort of have your startups innovate for these super groups, right? Because India is still agrarian to a large extent. And then, we also came, so we actually had to revise our list of innovations and tech solutions for these communities. We then came up with, included startups that send out SMSs or voice texts or just call the farmers up so they know about the change in weather patterns, and they will know when subsidies have been so delivered to the local distribution shops. And I think you really need these startups. You really need this kind of innovation, but innovation that really works in the developing country context, right?
Thank you so much. And I know Baratang wants to come in on that. Baratang Maya is the founder CEO of Girl Hype and Women Who Code from South Africa. Baratang, I know you looking at exactly these issues of marginalization and precisely the points that have been made here. When we speak about marginalization, it's not in the context of a northern scenario where you're talking about minorities and small groups of people. We're talking about the majority of people on the continent. And your particular focus is on gender within that marginalized group. So in terms of sort of intersectional inequalities, you're covering a spectrum of people who are marginalized, including by gender. Just tell us a little bit about your work with coding and training and the capacity you're trying to build and the importance of accessing data and possibly even needing a data commons.
Thank you, Alison. I'm going to start with a comment that I had when I attended the SDG roundtable discussion. The last speaker said the digital divide is very huge. We can sit here and talk about SDGs and talk about anything as long as we haven't sorted out the issue of people having access to internet, we're not talking. Because at the moment we're talking about data, who's collected it, what are they doing with it, and it's really not touching the power of data. The people who need data, who need to be empowered, do not know that power because it's driven at the moment from profits, and it's driven on decision making that is really not benefiting the people that it needs to benefit. And I think it's because it's missing. And I'll talk about what we do. So we started collecting our data through storytelling. Right from the beginning of Girl Hype in 2020, we were doing storytelling. And because we knew that the girls cannot speak English, what we're going to capture is what we are interpreting, not what they are saying, because when they speak English, there's language barrier in terms of collecting data. So we did storytelling, and we would see where they started and where they are in their life, and how far have we reached them when they come to an end. And then we were told that's not the right way to collect data. And that was like 16, 17 years ago. The City of Cape Town helped us put together a document where we were collecting data, and we measured the results. I'll tell you, 2 years ago, APSA came to start working with Girl Hype in schools to reach the girls. And the first thing they said to us is, we want stories. We do not want what you captured on a piece of paper. We want those girls to be here telling us their stories because we want to see one story at a time. And for me, that made such a huge change because normally we're looking at data from a perspective of we want to change. It is necessary. It's big decisions are made out of data, and governance is made out of data. If I make examples, the Indians will tell you that GPI is the best thing that has ever changed India because they have proper data, they have identity captured, the finance is changing. And I mean, if we think of Togo, the government of Togo managed to change the lives of 500,000 people, and apparently 90% of that was women, to be paid during COVID by just implementing GPI. So it depends on who's collecting data and what data we're talking about. But for women and girls, I fear that what's being collected is still very biased.
Well, I think we can come back to that. I think Rogers Lilwayo, who's the Senior Economic Advisor at UNDP South Africa. UNDP has been working, multiples of its projects has these data governance issues and underpinnings to it. Yes, please, and I've actually been asked to ask you all too, so please also do. Rogers, if you'd tell us what UNDP is doing in this area, what initiatives there are that might address these problems.
Okay, thank you, moderator, and thank you for inviting us to also give our insights to this Cape Town Conversation talk. Before I go into what UNDP does, I just wanted to highlight that, of course, data is the oil of the 21st century. It describes the world, and it is increasingly being used to shape it. And I'll use two examples. The one of it was in The Guardian of 2019, Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, a world designed for men. And I just want to pose these questions to you. Did you know that an average smartphone is about 5.5 inches long? It is too big for most women's hands, and it does not fit in their pockets. And speech recognition software is trained on recordings of male voices. In fact, the Google version it recognized 70%, it's 70% more likely to understand men. And then I think the Los Angeles Police Department, it was, it actually implemented what is called, predictive policing. And then it was really looking at property crime in Los Angeles. And what ended up happening, there was heavy policing. And this heavy policing was targeting black people. So you can see that though data is powerful, if it's not used correctly, and you don't involve the marginalized, they end up not benefiting from it. It may end up even putting them at a disadvantage in terms of even access to services and so on. So what does that mean? It means that if you want to be inclusive in this collecting data and even using data for policy making, you really need to include the marginalized. And I think it talks to what my fellow panelists talked about. Make sure that this data is collected in the language which the marginalized understand. And also empower them, use their community leaders. And to give a typical example, sometime when I was working in Tanzania, Tanzania had rolled out what is called this, a social protection system, which was conditional. But the way people were chosen to participate in this conditional social grant, they were using community leaders, because they're the ones who know who are the poor. Okay? And they even monitor, because it was conditional in terms of, do you send your children to school? Do you go to hospital for medical checkup and so on? And the degree of compliance was very high. And even when we're actually implementing this with the World Bank and other donors, and when you go there, you hear quite a number of stories. Some of these communities, these people who were receiving these conditional grants, ended up forming savings organizations and starting some projects which actually made them to graduate from poverty. So I think the issue of making sure that you involve these communities is quite important in really, in collecting this data, making it actually, even interpreting that data, what does it mean to them, and making this data accessible to them, because you are really empowering them. And we are seeing this because even, I know, for instance, in 2000, the World Bank published a report which was looking at trying to understand what does it mean for a person to be poor. And they were asking really the poor people themselves. And what came out of there was quite interesting, that these poor people actually know economics more than the professors, because they know what poverty is and even how to address their development challenges. And we are seeing this even in the recent multidimensional poverty report, which was published, UNDP published every year with the OFI. And what that report shows is that when you look at even multidimensional poverty, you'll find that people are, there are buckets of poverty, which you can actually see these people who are poor. So even to address their development challenges, you need a portfolio approach to really move them out of poverty. And I think it's quite important to, when we talk about that, we also see it in the report which our colleagues from the Human Development Office published, which is called Gender Social Norms. And that report really looking at, how people perceive issues to deal with, what are really the challenges of addressing, gender empowerment, women empowerment. And we see quite a lot of some interesting things there that we need really to tackle the gender social norms, because we do that survey quite a lot every year. And really it's quite an interesting study, because you see some trends, even people who say, they think it's okay if there's a job for a man to get that job. And really it means really, if we really want to tackle issues to deal with gender, we need to look at those gender social norms. And I think our work also, we work in quite a number of areas, even when you look at even human development in the Anthropocene. We see that when we collect the data, what we call the human adjusted human development index, countries who have got a high human development index, if you adjust it with what they are doing to the environment, it's actually showing this, interesting trend that it doesn't mean the richer you are actually doing any service to the environment. So I think some of this, and we look at it, and it's even influencing like the indigenous communities, nature-based, development, really to address what are really the development challenges. And we've seen some indigenous communities actually coming up to say, look, the way we measure development really has to change going forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I think there's so many issues we can pick up there. I think while it's obviously important that we speak to communities, I think this importance of getting the data, we don't even know our progress towards the SDGs because we haven't got the data, certainly on this continent, but I think globally as well, and Secretary General spoken to this. But I think, I think there's been a lot of discussion like this, but on the issue of, data being like oil, I think there's, an important point is that, in fact, it's not finite. It's, it can be resourced, we can get better access to it, we can make sure that the automated decision-making, if the right data does exist, does not prejudice, facial recognition for justice and those kinds of things. The problem is that without 60%, 50% in the world, 60% in Africa plus of people not being in that data, it's simply impossible to unbias some of that big data that is being used and which is driving the opportunities. Generative AI now, it's basically scraping the data from those of people who are online. And those of us who aren't online, simply aren't coming up in the data. And secondly, we don't have the opportunities that generative AI creates for, smooth lining and improving efficiencies and those kinds of things. So, these are very big challenges, and obviously we need to address data in these multiple ways. But, how can the private sector, the public sector, and civil society come together to find solutions to these very big problems? I think if we think of Africa, we've got, recently now participation in the G20, which is very exciting. In groups like the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, which India is also the president of this year, which is a member state-based organization, there are very, very few African countries, and we're just not participating in the global governance discussions. Another aspect of that I'd like you to speak out about in the context of your developing countries is very often our public policy processes. So we might be collecting data from poor people, but how involved are they actually in the public policy processes? And what are the initiatives maybe that you're undertaking in your countries to find both local but also to participate in global governance? So perhaps we just start in the middle and come this way, and then we'll go back there. Yeah.
Oh. What was your question? Okay, for me, I advocate for democratization of data, because organizations that work with women that really, not even women, anybody who's doing work of inclusivity, 80% of the time the budget goes to the people, the work. We don't have big researchers, money to be spending on research. So if you democratize data, we will have access to it, especially government officials. I'm listening to Mr. Rogers speaking about stats that I would have used very well for our organization to say, when we look for funding, it helps us because funders see that someone has done research that's very stable, because that gives us an opportunity to do targeted interventions for the work that we do. It gives us an opportunity to monitor and evaluate based on the research that was there, the data that's relevant. It gives us an opportunity to make informed decisions going forward for 10, 20, 30 years. And then it also gives us an opportunity to be innovative and collaborative. I think in this situation is corporates and us, civil society and the government, we all want to change people's lives. We all want to bridge the digital divide. We all want to change women and girls' lives. We want to do so much, but that collaboration is what we need. And I think data gives the power to say, if this one is doing this, I can do this, I can add this. And that way we accelerate and change this 156 years that UN is talking about to say it's going to take 160 years to bridge the gender gap. So I think for me, data democratization is the issue.
Prerna, perhaps you could pick up on that issue.
So I think, Alison, I think aggregation, collation of data and collaboration across the spectrum is the only way forward. And I think what this really requires is an alignment of incentive structures, be it between your private stakeholders, your companies, your consultancy firms, be it your startups, the innovative ones or the tech-driven startups, whether it's your civil society members who get money in from philanthropists or foundation. There has to be a common goal that we all work towards. And I'm going to try and explain this via a bunch of examples, right? We took the example of what happened during COVID, right? And among other things, I remember my organization, we collaborated very closely and advised the state government on how they need to use their volunteers who use these apps on their phones for distribution of certain government incentives. We advised them on how we could use the same app and the same set of volunteers to now collect information about what people needed because of COVID, right? Did they need healthcare amenities? Did they need food at the household level? You know, were they suffering because they'd lost their jobs? So just to get that information in, right? So in that case, we saw a startup coming forward to advise a government body using a tech platform, right? We've spoken a little bit about AI, right? Again, right, Times did this big story on countries such as India, and I know there are a few countries in Africa that serve as the back end for a lot of AI-related work. So when I take my phone and point it towards a bottle, for Google Lens to sense that it's a bottle, there's somebody or a lot of people at the back end who are looking at thousands and millions of pictures of bottles and telling the technology platform that, listen, when you see something like this, it's a bottle. Or when you see something like a plant, this is a plant, right? Yeah. So you need regulation around AI. So what I'm trying to say is that it requires that we regulate, that we get different parties to collaborate so that we're all moving forward.
Thanks, Prerna. I'm terribly sorry to cut people off, but we are running short of time, so I'm going to ask Rogers, please, for your 2 minutes, and then I'll come to Annie to finish this off.
I think, to me, I think what is important is how do we use data for advocacy, even within these marginalized communities, because this data can be a powerful tool to influence policy and to change some practices. Going back to the social norms, we can use that data to really change these social norms. And also, I think when we talk of even how do we train these communities, and we work as UNDP and the UN, we work with a lot with civil society organizations, even in terms of SDG reporting. We actually work closely with them so that even when the country is preparing their national voluntary review, the civil society also prepare their review, which feed into that process, so that when it comes to reporting in the high-level political forum, both civil society will also have inputs in terms of, what the country is saying. And we also support even local authorities in terms of reporting on the SDGs, in terms of what is called voluntary local reviews, because when we talk of leaving no one behind, that's where people are being left behind at the local level. So that's where we can see who is being left behind. And that's where we also identify the data gaps. What data is available so that we can work with partners, even the national statistical authorities, to make sure that we collect that data. To just give a typical example, there are some local authorities who are preparing those reports currently in South Africa.
Okay.
And working with Stats SA and other partners, we found out that, of course, some of them wanted to be very ambitious to report on all the SDGs, but that process has opened up the data gaps which exist at the local level and which as the UN and other partners, we think we should work together to bridge that gap to ensure that this clarion call of leaving no one behind is addressed.
Thanks very much. We're running out of time, so I'm going to ask whoever wants one question to be at the microphone, so when Anir finishes, we can go straight to that one question. Anir, if you would just, if you could keep it very tight, we've got very limited time, but thank you. Just to pick up on those important points of multiple levels of government participation is also very interesting.
I think the first thing that's really critical right now is to break the silos. I think all data lives in silos, within government, within private sector, within civil society, and there is no common language for data sharing. Recently, I found out in a panel, when I was with the chairman of Unilever in Bangladesh, that 40% of Unilever, which is an FMCG company, is actually owned by government. So I was just telling him, so you're 40% civil servant, so the way you make decisions about data, you can teach us within the government.
Anir, can you just hold your mic up so people can...
Oh, can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay, sure. So the way private sector makes decisions with data, I think the policymakers, government, and researchers don't make it that way. I think there's a lot to be learned from the large corporations, not just the big techs, just any corporation that effectively use data to make decisions. We did that during COVID. We actually learned from the private sector, worked with private sector data. Why not now? That's the first thing. Second, I think, is how we visualize data is important. So we visualize data in the way that researchers understand, economists understand, not policymakers. So there is a big bridging that we have to do. And the third is a really big education process of the policymakers in terms of how to use data from the non-traditional sources, including our NSOs, because policymakers still trust the way NSOs actually collect, aggregate, disaggregate, analyze data. And it's really old school. It's very, very old school. Recently, we had a project with UN called Data for Now, where we tried to actually bring in a sandbox concept where data from many different sources would come and we make decisions using that data. And that data is administrative data. That data is coming in on a real time. From an African country, Togo, we actually learned how to use cell phone data to do real-time poverty tracking. And we're now putting that to use in Bangladesh to change the way we program 16 to 70% of a national budget that goes into social safety net programs every year. Wow. So if you can improve targeting by reducing inclusion and exclusion error, which is what Togo has done, Togo has demonstrated that we can do something similar in Bangladesh. And once it works in Bangladesh, it's a large country with 30 million people under social safety net, so that's a breakthrough. So these are the innovations that we need to embrace within policy making by working with the private sector and the civil society.
And sharing between countries.
Absolutely, and data commons, important.
I know we're out of time. You're going to pose your question, and the panelists are going to ask you during the break as we shift into the next session. So please go ahead and pose your question. I think it's on. No?
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Sibulele Magini, and I'm a school principal of a low-cost private school in Khayelitsha that takes on girls from 3 years to 14 years, and we run a STEM program for them. My question speaks to what Prina mentioned about AI. As teachers, we find ourselves in a challenge with this introduction of AI. You know, back then when I was at school, we'll be assessed based on creative writing. You know, you write a short story, you write a friendly letter, you write an essay. Nowadays, these kids use AI for that. So you can't actually use that as an assessment. And as a result, AI is seen as an enemy in education. But AI is here to stay. So how do we relook at education in a way that we integrate AI into the classroom, and it's not we just leverage its power in the way that it can empower the kids and use it to empower them and to give them knowledge rather than putting it aside as something that the kids cannot use to access information. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. Absolutely critical one, and I think that a number of people on the panel would love to answer it. The problem is, if you're doing this and you're trying to use generative AI in Khayelitsha, you put in something, you get nothing. You put that in a school in New York or something, it might be useful. So definitely we'll come back to those issues with the panel after the session. Thank you so much, Anir. Your emphasis on, non-formal data, not traditional data, possibly breaking down of silos, sharing between countries, so important. And Prerna, your incentivizing these, alignment of incentives for data outputs, getting those data outputs, importance of collecting that data from communities, so important. And Baratang, democratizing data and all that goes with it, particularly in rectifying gender imbalances. And Rogers, I think the importance of, trying to get those SDG measures, not only at the national level, where you get aggregations that mask some of those inequalities and stuff, is so important, and important to come back to, but not now. So thank you so much to the panelists, and thank you to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, panel. If I could request you to join us for a quick photograph. A quick photograph, please. We will now move to the next session, Resources of the Future, Ensuring Sustainable Energy Access in the Global South. With us, we have Professor Mark Swilling, co-director of the Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University. He also leads the Just Energy Transitions platform, which they have created with UNDP. Richard Stewart, Chief Regional Officer for Southern Africa at Sibanye Stillwater. Shena Kiara Gokul, founder of the Legend Group, and the moderator, Professor Dr. Abla Abdel Latif, Executive Director and Director of Research at the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies. Resources for the Future, Ensuring Sustainable Energy Access. Moderator?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. This is one session before dinner. So we are standing between you and the last session and dinner, and we know that this is a tough time. But we feel guilty already. My three speakers and myself feel guilty, but we are going to hopefully wake you up during the session and make sure that you're interested. The session title is Resources of the Future, Ensuring Sustainable Energy Access in the Global South. Okay? We all know, it doesn't need any introduction or extended talk, that economic growth, social development, environmental protection cannot take place if there is no access to reliable and sustainable energy. And it's not only about those big titles, but it also, if you take it down, then you would find that your health sector is affected, your education is affected, your livelihood is completely affected, especially in the case of vulnerable groups and remote communities. Right? So it is extremely important topic. We only have half an hour for it, but we have three distinguished speakers in the field. So during this half hour, we are going to say everything that needs to be said about the topic. Let me first introduce our speakers. We have Professor Mark Swilling. He's the co-director of the Center for Sustainability Transitions, Stellenbosch University here in South Africa. We have Dr. Richard Stewart, is the Chief Regional Officer for Southern Africa, Sibanye Stillwater. And we have, last but not least, Ms. Shena Kiara Gokul, founder of the Legend Group here in South Africa. I welcome all of you. And let me start with you, Professor Mark. How can we ensure equitable access to sustainable energy for countries in the global south? Please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk mainly about the
context I'm most familiar with, which is the African context. But when we think of the Global South and the energy transition, obviously when it comes to the Asian context, China and India are completely dominant and are the biggest renewable energy markets in the world. But when we think of the African context, it's a very specific challenge. Africa is the only region in the world that has to face its development challenges in a carbon and resource constrained environment. That means that Africa has to find a low carbon transition pathway. Now, why this is significant is if you look at the installed generation capacity on the African continent, the total output of energy on the African continent is equal to the total amount generated in France and Germany combined, with 140 million people. Africa has over 1 billion, is growing relatively fast, and has to invest heavily over the next 3 decades in an energy infrastructure. If Africa energizes using fossil fuels, none of the targets that were agreed to in Paris can be achieved. And if none of the climate targets are agreed, that were agreed in Paris are achieved, that is going to have very negative consequences for the entire planet. So what that means is the world has an interest in investing in the African context in what we prefer to call a low carbon energization program. We don't like to talk about decarbonization on the African continent because there actually isn't much of an infrastructure to decarbonize. However, we do have a choice, which is to energize using fossil fuels, and there are substantial coal and gas and oil reserves on the African continent, or do we mobilize our very significant renewable energy resources? And if you look at all the quantifications of the total capacity for solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, plus the value chains that lie behind that, which are the material infrastructures and the critical minerals that lie on the African continent that will be required to build those infrastructures, what you are talking about when you talk about low carbon energization is a much larger industrial transformation. So you can't separate those two. However, when it comes to estimating the investment requirements to achieve this, there are three estimates that are influential. The one is the African Development Bank, which basically estimates that the difference between what is required and what is actually spent is about $99 billion per annum, versus other estimates like the Climate Policy Initiative, which estimates the gap at around closer to $200 billion per annum, and the Columbia Center for Sustainable Development, which estimates the gap at somewhere in between. So between $99 and $240 billion per annum is the gap that we face. And all over Africa, including in South Africa, there is work taking place on what are the investment requirements, in particular in water and energy infrastructures, to prepare our economies for what needs to happen if we are serious about economic development and growth. However, on top of those infrastructures, you need a whole range of industrial policies. Unfortunately, I would say that on the African continent, the way we understand industrial policies is old-fashioned. We still think in terms of picking winners. We think in terms of the state making the decisions rather than the state setting broad, long-term visions and missions. and allowing partnerships to shape the way we mobilize investment capital. One final comment. In Africa, there's still too much of a tendency to think that development has to be financed from external resources. The South African financial institutions are getting stronger. There's more and more venture capital on the continent. It's the region with the largest number of sovereign wealth funds, and there is an increasing number of mature pension funds. We Africans have to start thinking in terms of mobilizing the capital that is required for the energy transition that we have to invest in. We have absolutely no choice. And if we continue to look to the international community to fund our development, we will forever be in a subordinate position. That has to change. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mark. That was very interesting, and I'm glad you focused on Africa. Very glad you mentioned low carbon energization program and not no carbon, because I don't think Africa can afford no carbon. They will not be able to industrialize at all if it's no carbon. And it's always the catch with Africa on the unfair situation that they are starting on the path for development, but they have to rely on the renewables, which are a lot easier, a lot more difficult to use. I would like at the end, when we're done, if we have a minute, to ask you about green hydrogen, about hydrogen being, it's usually looked at as the alternative to fossil fuel when it comes to industry, but at the end, not now, because I have to make sure that we have the time. And you are right, of course, about the need for the industrial policy, and picking winner is a very old way of looking at it. It has to be different. Very interesting. Dr. Richard Stewart, Professor Mark mentioned the minerals, and Africa is very rich in minerals. So let me ask you, what are the strategies for building resilient supply chains for new fuels and critical minerals?
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I guess before we jump straight into the supply chain and what we need to do, maybe it's worth just sketching the scale of the challenge that we're dealing with. And I say challenge, but actually I think it's probably one of the greatest opportunities that the global South and Africa has faced in order to boost their economies. I think we're on the brink of the next super cycle in terms of a commodities boom. And I think that this super cycle is going to eclipse anything we've seen before. The last big one we had was in the 2000s, largely driven by the industrialization of predominantly China and other developing nations. What we're looking at now, the scale of what's going to be required in terms of metals to meet the goals that have been set out in documents like agreements like the Paris Agreement, is immense. If we just take just some numbers that have been quoted lately, I think Ian Sanders from Deloitte and Forbes, he indicated that if we achieve these objectives over the next 3 to 4 decades, we're talking about a $45 trillion industry and the creation of about 300 million jobs globally. The flip side to that is if we get it wrong, it's going to cost us about $180 trillion and about 800 million lives will be impacted. So we can't afford to get this wrong. If we take critical minerals as they are loosely defined at the moment, and I think they do vary per definition, but the critical minerals industry in 2022 was worth in the region of about $320 billion. Now that's still quite a small number relative to the global resources, but what is, I think, outstanding about that number is it doubled over the last 5 years. It's on a hyperbolic growth curve, and that curve is going to continue. It was the only group of minerals that grew over the last 5 years. Everything else was flat or shrunk. So when we think about these various minerals that we're targeting, I mean, what does it mean? If we take lithium as an example, key in terms of battery technology, lithium is forecast to grow by 5 times by 2030. Now, in mining terms, it takes 10 years to bring a new mine online. So to think about how we're going to deliver into 5 times demand growth in the next 7 years is quite an astronomical thought. Copper is expected to increase in demand by 50% over 7 years. That's a well-established industry. To find 50% more production, these are huge numbers, and the same thing can be applied to nickel and many of the other minerals that we're currently facing. And I think this is where the opportunity lies. Many of these critical minerals we find within the global south. South Africa is a core producer, the largest producer of platinum group metals, and that talks to hydrogen. A key aspect, hydrogen is actually forecast to be the biggest growing green energy source as we move forward into the future. We know about Central Africa, huge producers of copper and cobalt. The African continent, some of the biggest producers of manganese and vanadium. South America, copper, one of the biggest lithium producers, nickel. Russia, nickel. Indonesia, nickel. So a lot of these critical minerals come from the global south, and we absolutely need to be able to harness that. But I think in order to do it, and to Mark's point, we've got to start thinking differently. I actually don't think we need to be thinking about supply chains. Supply chains, inherently, when you think about that, you think about the chain, the link before you, very often your suppliers. How best can you optimize value from your supplier? And you think about your customer. How can you try and sell a little bit more to a customer at a higher price? We have to be thinking about ecosystems. This is not about a chain. It's about a group that has to come together and operate in an ecosystem for shared value for all parties. As a company, we've got a strategy which we call pandemic resilient ecosystems. And pandemic in this regard isn't viral pandemics. It's any shock to business. But it specifically talks about not just trying to sell metal onto the market and trying to get an extra dollar through trading. What we actually do is work with our downstream customers and partner with them, developing new technologies, understanding their constraints, making sure they understand ours, and that technological development and demand is going to match supply, and that we can, in fact, deliver into those supply chains sustainably. I think one of the key concerns that we need to be very worried about is whether or not we're positioning ourselves to be able to deliver into the supply chain. I think if I just use an example from South Africa at the moment, it's not a critical mineral, but if we talk about chrome, chrome, we are one of the largest producers of chrome that is used in steel manufacturing. We currently export it to China. The reality is we export chrome ore. We actually mine rocks and send rocks via ships to China to be fabricated, and you have to ask yourself why. The first step in fabrication of chrome is producing an alloy called ferrochrome, and basically you put that into a smelter and produce an alloy. There's no technical reason why we can't do it, except our energy constraints. That is the one reason we do not beneficiate chrome in South Africa. My point to this is, while we worry about beneficiation and while we worry about downstream, if we haven't got our own house in order to deliver into being able to mine, into being able to transport, and into being able to get these metals into the ecosystem that's needed, we're going to fall short at that point. So I think to try and sort of summarize, if I had to say what are the two big things we need to focus on to ensure we have sustainable supply chains, the first one is we've got to move away from supply chain thinking and move towards ecosystem thinking, and really develop with partners who share value throughout that entire value chain. I think the second aspect is each player within that ecosystem needs to clearly understand the value they bring, not only to themselves, but to the entire ecosystem and partners to help the development of the entire chain, and make absolutely sure that they are able to deliver their critical portion of that ecosystem. If we don't get these two things right, I've outlined the scale of this problem, we'll never be able to tackle it and keep up.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Richard. It's for this excellent analysis. Imagine the number, $43 trillion and millions of jobs. Absolutely amazing. But if you go wrong, this is like gambling. If you go wrong, you are doomed, okay? And the exponential increase in demand. And of course, the main focus you mentioned, and I agree with it, that we shift from the supply chain thinking to the ecosystem thinking. Again, if we have time at the end, I would like to ask you what you think about having, those minerals are essential for the transition, for protecting the planet. They're typically exported from Africa, okay? The issue is, the calls are for now, this to be used inside Africa for its development and not just be exported. So what you think about that? But again, if we have time to go to these questions. Now, the only lady in the panel, usually ladies are first, but this time I made an exception, she's last. Mishina Kiara Gokul, How best, in your opinion, how best can resources be leveraged to finance the transition to sustainable sources of energy?
Thank you, Abla. I think what we've identified from what Mark and Richard have said is that these are complex issues, and Africa certainly is at the heart of it. And as much as we'd like to digress from an Afrocentric approach, we must acknowledge that the world can't achieve their sustainable development goals. Any country in the world can't achieve their sustainable development goals without Africa getting their house in order. And I always like to use the anecdote that Africa is the it goal that most countries in the world wants to court, potential partnerships, and the world is sort of coming to Africa's door and offering not much, but something, and not enough to kind of get us off the ground in terms of where we need to be heading in terms of our sustainable development goals, energy transition. So I think our decision-making as an African continent, as it relates to resources, we need to start thinking about our resources in silo of each other, because our resources are not limited to the critical minerals on the continent, commodities. Our resources are far bigger than that. Our resources are our people, our deals, our youthful population, the women on the continent, how the entire ecosystem, the value system. And when we talk about value systems, we often think about supply chains and we think about industrial capacity. But if we start looking at it from a more holistic, softer angle, we'll start to see that until we don't synergize and collaborate these strengths across the continent, our goals are just merely goals. And we spoke about it earlier. We said that goals are piling up. And in Africa, we often struggle, in the planning phase. And we struggle to get things off the ground. We struggle to connect the dots between our disciplines and our strengths. Even here, platforms such as this is a resource because the academics are doing the research work. We looking to our decision makers to kind of lead the way, steer us in the right direction. We need private sector participation. So these are all the resources that we need to leverage in order to meet our sustainable development goals. But how? We talk on all the points, the wealth of resources, the lithium reserves, the nickel reserves. We need to start now collaborating and bringing it all into the fore. So I think that instead of approaching resources from a solely energy perspective, we must leverage all of our resources collectively in order to really enhance and build on the communities where these resources exist in order to create value. So we're often saying move away from extraction, start coming into the communities, developing the communities, and the policy instruments need to be put in place to protect the communities where these minerals exist, to make sure that value is retained at home first. And I understand and recognize that's a very Afrocentric approach, but I think we must start to look away from the narrative of Scramble for Africa more towards the rise of Africa. And the world needs to acknowledge that once Africa rises, it will be able to give outward. So a lot more effort needs to be maintained in those communities, coming back home, supporting the women, youth. I think we find if we use our youth as a resource as well, women as a resource, we'll be able to go a lot quicker and faster. So I think what I'm trying to allude to is that it's more than just knocking into the ground and taking things out, transforming it and selling it. Because then what? The communities get left behind. Energy poverty is exacerbated by the financial instruments and mechanisms that are currently put in place that kind of perpetuate the cycle of energy poverty, and kind of leaving us in debt traps. So if we can just widen our lens a little bit and change our focus away from commodity-based resources and think of things more holistically, I think we'll be able to scale up and finance the transition more smoothly and set examples, because Africa definitely has the potential to set examples for the rest of the world, innovative potential. We just need to understand that the clean energy transition should not just be looked at as a business for some and a mechanism for survival for others. If it's good as a business for some, it's good as a business for us, for Africa. But the way we do businesses in Africa is with heart and with feeling, and I think if we pour that outward and start drawing the world into the way we do things on the continent, that's the way that we're going to scale up. So there's a bit of a woman's touch for you.
Thank you. Because I'm greedy, I'm going to go back to my questions for both of you, and I have one for you as well. Give me an example of what the private sector can do, okay? But let me start with Professor Mark on the hydrogen. Green hydrogen is supposed to be, my understanding, the only type of energy that can best be used for industrialization because it burns like in a similar way to the fossil fuels. What do you think of that? Is this true or not? What do you think?
I'm sorry to say, but you're fundamentally wrong.
Okay, tell me, please.
Green hydrogen is not a source.
Okay.
You have to make hydrogen. And in order to make hydrogen, you need energy. So if you want to make green hydrogen, you need renewable energy as your energy source in order to split the water molecule using electrolyzers. And the result is hydrogen that you can use as a means of transportation of electricity. It's not a source. So it can never, ever, ever replace coal, oil, gas, and it can never be a substitute for wind and solar. It's a necessary part of the picture. However, the cost of green hydrogen has to come down. It's now just below $5 per kilogram. It has to drop to at least 1.5, ideally $1 per kilogram. And yes, the learning curves are have been quite steep, and the price is dropping, but it's probably another 5 years before it really comes into commercial reality. So when we factor it into the African story and the South African story, we must tell our politicians it's not another source of energy, because that's how they talk, and they are fundamentally wrong. It's a carrier of energy, and you need a renewable energy infrastructure in order for it to be green. And so, in other words, if you support green hydrogen, you actually support renewable energy. But the people who raise the banner for green hydrogen don't realize that. And that there's a lot of confusion in this ballgame.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, on the minerals, should Africa seek to export it because it's needed to produce the electric car? You need so many minerals, or should it be directed to the development in Africa, be kept here? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's so firstly, I think it's horses for courses. I think they're different. You've got to look at different minerals differently and understand how they behave. I think as I shared in a discussion this morning, you know, in my mind, it's really about how are you creating the value and what is your ultimate objective. And this is where that ecosystem model comes back in. So let me give an example. I know, there was some comments about, take cobalt. If we have a look at something like cobalt gold goes into batteries. So if you're going to bring that back onto the continent, you effectively have to have a use for batteries on the continent and create that demand. And the reason for that is, once you put cobalt into a battery, you don't want to transport batteries. It's simply expensive, and two, it's not safe. So you do not want to be transporting batteries, so you rather transport the raw materials. So would it make sense to beneficiate cobalt on the continent? Only if you've got that demand, which today we don't. But how do you build that into an ecosystem model? Well, the way to do it is a lot of the people who are looking for cobalt, European companies in particular, many of those, for example, are also the same companies that provide the heavy mining equipment that is used to mine the cobalt. The ecosystem model should say, come and develop the local supply chains within the country for that equipment and electrify it. That won't only add value to local economies, it'll also produce a skill set. That skill set could ultimately end up in automotives, and through that you create an economy where in the long run you can look at how you could potentially beneficiate on the continent. So I think very often we jump straight to beneficiation as a solution. What we need to look at is where are we competitive, and where we are not, how do we partner with those who are competitive? But this is where I say talk about an ecosystem, not a supply chain. Do not just sell the metal to the person who's prepared to pay $1 more. Sell the metal to a partner who's prepared to reinvest back into the entire circular chain and uplift value across that entire ecosystem.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, now back to you. Back to you, Sheena. Can you give an example for what the private sector can do in 50 seconds?
I think for me, it's subsidize youth employment. Start giving graduates an opportunity to get involved in the decision making, to get their foot in the door, start holding their hand in some of the projects, even if it's just for a short while. They can afford to. And once we start doing that, I think we'll see a lot more entrepreneurship emerging, SME growth and development, which is the driving force on the continent. And yeah, we can certainly drive more innovation by getting our youth and women involved.
Thank you very much. We actually have 46 seconds to go. Does anyone have a question, a pressing question for these three experts? It's a chance. Yeah, go ahead, quickly. Here and here. Okay, we have two questions. Go ahead. Go ahead first.
Thank you for this panel. My first comment is the Global South appears to be the land of natural energy and natural source of energy in diverse ways. However, the Global South is still the land who is suffering a lot of benefiting that opportunity. What is the real gap?
No.
The question,
one point only, because
yes.
we are running out of time.
My comment, no, can I finish, please? The issue of, thank you.
Sorry, it has to be one question, because the lady has to ask a question and our time is up. So we were lucky to grab your first question. Yes. Okay? Please?
I think Pereira make it clear when she was talking about be able to really be transparent on how we use the potential and how we also bring the private sector in to harness and to contribute in sustaining energy in the South.
All right, thank you very much. Please.
Thank you very much for a wonderful discussion. I'm a little bit disappointed, I must say, as a geopolitical strategist, because I was expecting that you will also address some of the geopolitical issues. Energy transition, one of the most important transformational processes, is apparently a process that will benefit the few. And once again, I see actually Africa turning into a continent which will be the playground for the next big power competition over the rich resources, specifically when it comes to the resources linked to the energy transition. And one important fact was missed out, that is that 600 million Africans are still lacking electrification, and we know for a fact that energy transition will be very much about electricity. So I would like you to comment on that, how this time will be a different story for African people, where once again, you know, the dirty mining of the new resources, rightfully pointed out, that will be mined, and a lot of them will be mined in Africa, but how actually we will all make sure that this is not going to turn in the very same way as it happened in the previous competitions over resources. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you. We're actually out of time, but I will give 30 seconds for Mark, 30 seconds for Richard. 30 seconds for real.
The bottom line is the bulk of the wind and solar resources that the world is going to need is in the global south. The bulk of the minerals and metals that are required for the infrastructures of the future are in the global south. The bulk of the biodiversity and ecosystems required for adaptation are in the global south. Capital is in the global north. So unless we address the fundamental inequalities when it comes to the allocation of capital, we will never have a just transition, which is why the global financial system and its reform is top of the agenda. UN Secretary General, African presidents and prime ministers, all are calling for a reform of the global financial system. That needs to be the focus.
Thank you. Richard?
No, I think Mark's absolutely correct, and I think trying to, again, we've got to separate between whether or not we're looking at trying to solve completely internally a circle where we are shy of capital, or whether or not we're trying to look at broader economic growth and overall upliftment. You're 100% correct. There are 600 million Africans today that don't have exposure to electricity. You know, I think the one other aspect that I would say that is a significant advantage that comes with renewables is that generally speaking, renewables, yes, on a big scale, they do require significant capital, but different to fossil fuels, a lot of that can be diverted, split up, spread between the private sector as well as public, and that's something we've really got to harness. I mean, South Africa is an example where just over the last year, between households and the private sector, we've put 3.5 gigawatts of extra power onto the grid. To put that into perspective, that's the equivalent of what Kusile was due to put onto the grid. That's taken 15 years and cost 150 billion. So I think coupling the whole renewable program together with electrification opens up a whole lot of different avenues to try and expand that.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Please, a big hand for this beautiful panel.
Thank you so much, panel.
Remember those guys. You will see them during dinner, so you can catch them and ask more questions. Thank you.
Definitely do that. If I could request the panel to join us for a photograph. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic session. Please, a quick photograph. As the moderator in the session mentioned, we have one more session to go before dinner. But before I call the speakers out and announce the session, a couple of housekeeping announcements. Post the session, we break for dinner, and as last evening, you will walk out to Hall 5, and on your way, you will see the bar. But the bar, again, will open post-dinner. We will have, the dinner will be from 7:30 to 9, and at 8:45, the bar opens, and at 9:15, we reconvene in this room for a late evening red-eye panel on women entrepreneurs in the Global South. So dinner at 7:30 to 9, and 8:45 is when we open the bar. The next session is Guardians of the Coast, Island States and Climate Challenges. On the panel, we'll have President Mohammad Nasheed, former Speaker of the House in Maldives and also the former President of Maldives, in conversation with Mr. Sanjoy Joshi, Chairman at the Observer Research Foundation. If I could request my colleagues to invite the speakers on stage. This is an in-conversation session, Guardians of the Coast, Island States and Climate Challenges. On the panel, we'll have President Mohammad Nasheed in conversation with Mr. Sanjoy Joshi, Chairman at the Observer Research Foundation. Gentlemen, if you could take your seats on stage, please. Mr. Joshi, over to you.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this panel, which is basically going to be discussing climate threats and small island nation, except that my own view is that climate threats today endanger everybody. And it is no one community's isolated problem, because climate-induced issues, whether there be problems of migrants, people moving, any kind of devastation, actually spills over into various domains. So it is a threat to everybody. And we're very glad that today we have a very well-known figure, President Nasheed, who actually brought into focus, drilled it into global consciousness, the fact that for certain vulnerable populations living in small island states, climate change was an existential threat. It was not something abstract. It was not something which would happen in 2030, 2040, 2050. It was happening every day, and they were living the consequences. And that focus on mitigation, yes, but even greater focus on how do you adapt? How do you transform lives? Became a very important focal point during climate negotiations. So welcome, President Nasheed. It's a pleasure having you here. My first question to you is, now you've been involved in the COPs all along. That you were at the Glasgow COP, and you've been very vocal saying that any hopes of sticking to that 1.5 degree target seems a very distant dream. And today in 2023, that is being repeated over and over again by professional agencies, so much so that perhaps the feeling is sinking in that in 2023, with all the wars and everything happening around us, the focus coming back on traditional energy security, it seems the Paris Accord was written for a different world in a different time. Where do we go from here?
Well, thank you very much, Joshi. And it's lovely to be here in Cape Town and in South Africa. The war in Gaza and also the war in Ukraine has shadowed many, many very important environment issues. And we must bring these issues back to focus, especially from here, we go to COP in Dubai. I am presently working for the Climate Vulnerable Forum. These are now 58 countries. In 2009, 9 countries got together and we formed the forum. Now in the COP, this forum is now 58 countries and it has become a treaty organization. So we will be a negotiating bloc, and we will, again, will focus on 1.5 degrees. We will focus on adaptation and mitigation as well. Now, how do we bring the focus back on environment? First, now, this is not a problem for the little Maldives in the middle of the Indian Ocean. The amount of people dying in Germany is more than the Maldives through bad weather. We have more than 20 countries who would probably go into default in the next 2-3 years because of bad weather, because of rains, droughts, floods, you name it. So I think your question is how are we going to bring the focus back on the environment? Nature will bring it back on the environment. There will be storms, there will be droughts, and these storms and bad weather incidents would become stronger and stronger and stronger Right now, we see Gaza on our screens. Everyone is seeing Gaza on the screens. But you will soon start seeing bad weather on the screen. And recently there has been a lot of bad weather on the screen. And I think how we bring back focus to climate issues is nature will do that. I'm very unfortunate that we were naive enough to wait until the worst storm is upon us. And it is upon us. Hopefully this monsoon would be better, but I can't see it becoming better. So we will see the environment in focus. It has nothing to do what I do or you do. It will be India's focus. It will be everyone's focus because nature is doing it. It's none of us. And it will have to come to focus. We will not survive if the world temperatures rise above 1.5 degrees. Now, 1.5 degrees is sacred. Reefs start dying anything above that. Trees start dying anything above that. Swells are higher, waves are bigger, and the rain is more. So it will be a focus. Both of us would not have to do anything about it. Nature and God will do it.
Well, the best thing is nature having a seat at the negotiating table. But I don't think that is going to happen. Ultimately, how do the vulnerable, the ones who are most at threat because of climate change, improve their negotiating position at successive COPs?
Thank you. You see, as I said, the Climate Vulnerable Forum would be a negotiating bloc now. It's hopefully not going to be G77 in China. So it's these 58 countries would vigorously negotiate for 1.5 degrees and for better protection of the environment. So we have this, what we call the climate prosperity plans. These are low carbon development strategies that would give you the same economic outcomes without trashing the planet. So it would call for better irrigation. It would have more techniques on how to survive, on adaptation. It would call for nature-based solutions. And we will make sure that we survive. And we cannot, I've been going to, as you mentioned, I've been going to COP for the last so many years. The only thing, the good result that has come out from the last COP, I saw COP children. So negotiators had got married to each other, and now we have COP children, but nothing else other than that. But we do need a legally binding agreement that all sides agree to, and we must get this agreement. Okay, the Paris Agreement was supposed to be that agreement, but it's still not a legally strongly binding agreement. So we need that agreement among ourselves for us to survive. It's very sad that everyone thinks that this is a Maldives problem. No, it's a Manhattan problem. It's a problem for every country. Just imagine, a quarter of the world's population live on low-lying areas, in coastal areas. Now, if they start migrating, and if they go on the move, we will panic. We saw what happened when 1 million Syrians started moving. Fortress Europe locked everything up. And the same thing is going to happen when bad weather hits you. So the question is, when would you leave your home, deciding that you cannot live anymore here? So I think that is, that unfortunate time is coming closer and closer to us, while we are still naive and talking about so many other unnecessary things. We will bring this issue to the focus, and nature will have a position in the negotiating table, because these climate vulnerable 58 countries have no other choice other than that. They are debt-ridden. They can't pay back their debt because bad weather is upon them. And bad weather keeps on destroying every production, every infrastructure that they build. So you see, these 58 countries took a loan to build a house, to build a school, to build a bridge. And the bad weather has taken away the bridge, the house, and the hospital, but the debt remains. So we are now paying 20% of our income on debt repayment and 30% on adaptation. And so you can see that we have no money now for health, education, recreation, and many, many other things that we would need to survive as a prosperous country or people. Yes, we need a position in the negotiating table, and we will get that. We will make sure that we have that position. We are not going to just stand around and say, okay, we didn't have a position, we didn't get a position. We will make sure that we have that position. And I think vulnerable countries coming together, understanding their strength, wanting to negotiate on their behalf, will make sure that we have that seat. And I'm sure India would also assist us in getting that seat.
So let's start thinking about what kinds of instruments. I mean, start talking of debt restructuring. Debt restructuring in favor of countries which are actually having to adapt, which are actually giving the world the lungs to breathe. When you start looking at this, are there certain instruments which are being thought of? There's a lot of talk going on about blue bonds. I know there are lots of other instruments being talked about, but are there practical examples on the ground? Do you think there's a hope for them, or are these headed the way of the ESG initiatives?
Now, both Sri Lanka and Ghana are trying to restructure their debt. Seychelles has recently done it, and Seychelles is a very good example of a debt to environment swap. So basically what these countries are saying is, we have the trees, and for you to breathe, you need our trees. So we have your lungs. These industrial nations, they have cut down their trees long time ago, 200, 300, 400 years ago. And when you go on the train in England or anywhere in Europe, you would see vast areas of grassland and farms, which used to be thick forest. We now have the trees, and what we are suggesting is, we swap our debt to environment protection. We will look after the trees, we will have better management plans, we will get carbon sequestration, we will find the science on how much ton of carbon would be sunk into one tree. So how much would you pay for my tree? I think we have better assets than anyone else, because you will not breathe without our trees. So the blue bonds is not working right now, especially because I think we are selling a tree to 2 people. So get the science right, get the maths right, and make sure that these forests are properly looked after, properly managed, and also therefore traded in carbon bonds. This doesn't have to be traded in European countries alone. It can be done in southern countries as well. And I hope that a debt to environment swap becomes a IMF prescription for debt structuring. Now, IMF is still a little bit reluctant to bring in environment swaps when restructuring debt. They call for austerity. And when you go into all this austerity, finally, yes, your debt becomes sustainable, but your country is no longer, because there's another riot. So we are talking about prosperity. And debt to environment swaps are pathways for prosperity and debt restructuring without going into all the austerity and therefore another riot.
Let me take you to another subject. There was when you spoke about the threats to small island states. There was a lot of talk at that point of time about investing in properties elsewhere for people to migrate. Today, the focus seems to be shifting. Today, we are talking of geoengineering projects. We're talking of land reclamation. We're talking of pouring concrete into perhaps the oceans, into coral reefs, to be able to create an environment, fortress islands, where people can move and live in their own localities. Do you think that's a solution?
No, I don't think that's a solution. I don't think pouring concrete over nature is adaptation. And I don't think another few millimeters of steel is going to save the planet. We must bring nature-based solutions. For instance, in the Maldives, it costs us $3,000 for an embankment, $4,000 a meter of water breaker. So 1 meter of coastline is $7,000. We have 2,000 islands. So this is just completely impossible. But to grow a reef, it's $25 a meter. The problem with the reef is it grows very slow. So we need more science into genetics of the reef. We need to find a resilient coral that would survive higher temperatures. And I'm sorry, we need to genetically modify it so that it can survive the future to come. Trying to work against nature is not going to save you, but we must try and work with nature. The present idea of adaptation is concrete. And that's not a way of going about this. I am convinced that it's not working in the Maldives. It's not working in anywhere that I have had a look at. But if you do grow a reef, and also if you have proper grass cover, for instance, on your soil, that would work against mudslides, landslides, and floods, and so on. So more nature-based solutions and less concrete will save the planet, and that is going to give us prosperity, not the concrete. I don't think the concrete is going to save us.
When you look at, say, South Africa, when you look at Africa as a whole, when you start looking into neighbors across in India, what is it that you expect from, say, a country like South Africa, from countries like India, to be able to better your negotiating positions, to be able to take concrete action which takes care of the most vulnerable on this planet and moves the ball forward and not backward on this whole game where we are stuck in?
So first, science. We want your science. We think that there's a lot more science to do in coming up with these nature-based solutions. So South Africa, India, Brazil, these are now very rich countries with a lot of money and a lot of universities, a lot of bright students. And so one thing that we would be asking from you is the science to survive and to spend more on finding these new methods of working with nature. And also during negotiations. Now, unfortunately, this G77 and China bloc, China has an ambition of 2 degrees. 2 degrees will kill us. Now, how can we partner with someone and negotiate for our own suicide? I think this sounds extremely silly. So unless and until you agree to 1.5, we can't work with China. This is extremely impossible. Now, we had a look at India's ambition, South Africa's ambition. When we add everything together, it survives around 1.5 degrees. And so we can work with South Africa and India and Brazil, but anyone who talks about 2 degrees is a no-go area. So that is primarily why the Climate Vulnerable Forum has come into form, and we have decided to become a negotiating bloc. We will negotiate, hopefully, during this COP. And your question is, what can you do? Please agree with us. Please don't argue. Please agree to 1.5. We will not survive without 1.5. South Africa, Brazil, and India, Indonesia. These are big economies, big countries, and they can really assist us in surviving. And we can find solutions. So our ask would be for you to back 1.5.
So as far as the new group is concerned, which you, and this is, thank you for sharing it with us, what was going to be a strategy of this negotiating group. What would you be demanding, say, at the next COP?
Well, again, I've been going to COPs for a long time. I don't think I want to talk about loss and damage anymore.
Okay.
You could go on talking about it until you become blue in the face. Someone mentioned 100 billion today also. This was agreed in 2009 to me actually, in Copenhagen, that rich countries would pay $100 billion a year for adaptation and mitigation. But this money never came. And I can't see this money coming anytime soon either.
So how do we move beyond this now? We are in a logjam,
okay.
Money is not going to be coming. How do we create
the private sector?
Okay. So tell me more about that.
So the Climate Vulnerable Forum countries have a lot of state-owned enterprises. And these are huge things that are making extremely bad decisions and very good losses. And, there was one conversation that they had here in the morning. The South African former finance minister, now the governor of the central bank, he was saying that the state is actually against the private sector. They are against the private sector because they love their state-owned enterprises, which has probably a bigger budget than the national budget. And you can dish out jobs and you can dish out many things for elections through a state-owned enterprise. But one thing that we would like to see now is these enterprises to be privatized and private money coming into climate vulnerable countries and assisting our economic systems to benefit from their investments. If the CVF countries, the Climate Vulnerable Forum countries, can decide to sell a part of their, or privatize part of their power plants for renewable energy, that is, then I think there is a way of a revenue stream coming into us. We also want to trade in carbon. We want to ask the 58 countries, how much of your forest can you put into a fund? And how much of this fund can be used to trade and for the communities of the forest to benefit from that? So I think the forest fund and the privatization effort of Climate Vulnerable Forum countries can give us some amount of funds for us to survive.
Thank you. We're just running out of time, and I want to take some quick questions from the floor. There are mics around, so if you could please move forward. Anyone who has questions, grab a mic and raise your questions. Yes, please. Just introduce yourselves and short questions.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Babalom Tingi, a member of SASCO. The reason I stand here, former president, is just to understand that...
Sir, you have to speak to your mic. The president was very, very upset that no one was speaking into the mic.
Oh, am I audible? Oh, okay. So, former president, my question is very brief, that one thing that has become a summary of the conference we're in is that change is an inevitable force. But then how do we ensure that the change that we want to see does not become a rupture change, but a transition? That we need to understand that as African continent, we faced what we call colonialism of a special type. So how do we then transition the change so that it is sustainable and meets the requirements that we face as Africans, and that it does not become a rupture which is harshly brought upon our people with no substantive force or substantive ways that we can actually mediate that change? So how do we ensure that change is a transition rather than a rupture?
How do you get into a sustainable transition?
You see, most of our state-owned power companies are actually older than our own countries. Like Ceylon Power Corporation, Maldives State Electricity Corporation, any of these power corporations are bigger, are actually older than our own countries. So unless we find a transition plan for labor in these existing state-owned enterprises, there will always be pushback from them in bringing the new technology. The new technology has not come to us primarily, I believe, because of our own state-owned enterprises pushing it back. Not because there are people who do not want to invest, not because we don't have the science, but the, state electricity company in the Maldives, the people who are buying spare parts for it, fuel for it, lubrication oil for it, all sorts of things for it, are very, very, very powerful. And they are entrenched in our governments because the state-owned power company is older than the government, than the country. So we need to find a transition plan, labor transition plan for the state-owned enterprises.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Maura Feil. I work for the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And I would like to pick up on some of the themes we had yesterday about the G20 and BRICS and the representation of the Global South in these fora, because, of course, the main forum of negotiation for climate is the COP, and you have your own bloc in there to negotiate, but you do not at the moment have the same seat at the table in G20 and BRICS. So I would like to ask from that perspective what your expectation is regarding particularly the G20 and the BRICS on climate, and whether you consider that partners from the Global South adequately take on board your interests as small island development states. Thank you.
Two things there. From BRICS, from G20, 1.5. Another thing is, it's not only my problem, it's your problem as well. It's not just the Maldives which is going to sink. Everyone else is going to sink with us. So please don't marginalize this issue by saying that this is a problem for the tiny little Maldives in the middle of the Indian Ocean. No, this is a problem for the planet. And from G20, 1.5. And, I am encouraged because most of the European countries are aligned with that. So is India. So, half the work is almost done. So we need the US and China. How can we do that? By shaming them. We can't bomb them. But, they can bomb us, but we can't bomb them. But the only thing we can do is shaming them. It is utterly shameful what you are doing.
So that is dot on time, I think. Thank you, President Nasheed, for those words, putting climate action back on the agenda at the next COP, bringing it center stage, and working with the G20, with the BRICS, with every other coalition possible to bring it center stage, not get diverted in a very difficult and troubled time. I think that is a message we need to send and take back from here at the Cape Town Conversations. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you very much. It's been lovely being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Joshi, and thank you, President Nasheed. The photograph, please. With that, we conclude this segment, and we invite all of you for dinner at hall number 5. As I mentioned, we will come back and reconvene in this room at 9 o'clock. 8:45, the bar will open. Do get some dinner, and then please do join us back. I do understand it's been a very long day, but we just need a few more hours of your life. Thank you so much, and please join us for dinner. Thank you.